Due to the COVID-19 health emergency, of course, today's hearing is being held remotely. All members, witnesses, and staff will be participating in video conferencing, and as part of our proceeding, microphones will be set on mute for the purposes of eliminating inadvertent background noise. Members and witnesses, you know this already, but please unmute your microphone each time you wish to speak. And I do want to announce a wonderful new announcement for this subcommittee. Scott Peters from California will be the vice chair of this committee for this Congress. And so if at any time during the hearing I'm unable to chair it, the vice chair, Mr. Peters, will serve as chair until I'm able to return. And we may have some votes during the hearing, but Mr. Peters and I have talked, and we will try to stagger our time so that we will continue throughout the votes. Each vote is 45 minutes long, so I don't think that should be any problem. And we, out of courtesy to our witnesses, we want to make sure that we don't have long breaks in the hearing. Documents for the record can be sent to Austin Flack at the email address we provided to staff. All documents will be entered into the record at the conclusion of the hearing, and the chair now recognizes herself for the purposes of an opening statement. Today, we continue this subcommittee's long record of oversight of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Our panel today is very, very distinguished. They've all dedicated their careers to improving our nation's air, water, land, and economy, and can provide critical insight on how to restore the vital mission of the EPA. We thank them and for the views that they will share today on how to strengthen this very important agency. For 50 years now, we've relied on the EPA to take on and mitigate our nation's most complex environmental threats, and its work is crucial to help protect public health and the environment. For example, EPA developed standards to reduce air pollutants that cause early death and worsen lung and heart disease. Every day, the agency helps ensure the safety of drinking water for millions of Americans. And it oversees the cleanup of hundreds of contaminated Superfund sites across the country, many of which pose enormous environmental risks. So given the importance and scope of EPA's mission, this is an agency that we simply cannot afford to neglect. And today that's even more true than ever. For example, every year climate change is contributing to an extended hurricane and wildfire season, threatening billions of dollars in catastrophic losses to homes and businesses. And every year we seem to break new climate and weather records throughout the U.S. In my own home state of Colorado, for example, just last year, we witnessed the 3 largest fires ever recorded in the state's history, and all at the same time. And when extreme weather and environmental catastrophes hit, it frankly is often the most vulnerable populations that bear the brunt. We see this in floods and hurricanes. We even saw this last month in Texas, where many people face crushing power bills and they had to wait in long lines to access food and to access water. With the environmental pressures facing this country increasing, certain policies have failed to keep up with the threats. To make matters worse, we recently saw a reversal of key environmental efforts designed to make the country cleaner and healthier. For example, over the last few years, the Trump administration compromised or entirely eliminated dozens of important protections. Examples include the repeal of the Clean Power Plant, the weakening of the mercury and air toxics rule, and the rollback of fuel efficiency standards for automobiles. Also, during those years, key EPA functions were put at risk. For instance, pollution inspections failed considerably at times, threatening the agency's ability to hold polluters accountable and to set a level playing field. The application of science, which is traditionally the backbone of EPA's decision-making, was not only sidelined, but sometimes denied. For example, the term climate change disappeared from thousands of federal websites and official communications. Panels of independent experts who provided crucial input on air pollution science were suddenly dismissed. Staff departed the agency at alarming rates, sometimes choosing to leave after concerns of political influence on the scientific process. So, as we look again to empower EPA, we cannot just focus on regulations and policies. We also have to rebuild the institutional capacity, scientific integrity, and, in fact, the credibility of the agency itself. And we must fully support EPA's career workforce so that it can address the environmental problems of today and in the future. Well, while the agency faces significant challenges, of course, we also have opportunities. History has shown environmental and economic progress are not mutually exclusive, but if done right, they reinforce each other. For example, the benefits of air regulations implemented by EPA over the last 30 years are estimated to be more than 30 times more the cost. Likewise, efforts to remove lead from gasoline have saved trillions of dollars by substantially curbing childhood lead poisoning. In other words, a strong EPA can go and has gone hand in hand with a strong economy. Because of the past successes and committed new leadership, I'm hopeful for the future. Starting on day one, the Biden administration has shown a desire to get EPA's mission back on track. The president has ordered an immediate review of dozens of rollbacks issued in the last administration and has stressed the importance of a government-wide approach to addressing climate change. Moreover, the president also stated that EPA will prioritize environmental enforcement in low-income and minority communities. But it's going to take a sustained effort by EPA, stakeholders, and Congress if the agency is to succeed in its mission of protecting public health and the environment. I hope that we can all play our part, and today's hearing will contribute to that effort. And so I'm really looking forward to hearing from the former EPA officials and experts about what they see as the most serious challenges facing us and how we can address them, because at this critical moment, we just simply have no time to lose. And with that, I'm delighted to recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Griffith, for 5 minutes for purposes of an opening statement. Mr. Griffith.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate you holding this hearing on the path forward for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. I want to thank all the witnesses for joining us today, particularly Dr. Deskins, who is originally from Honaker in Russell County, which is part of Virginia's 9th Congressional District. And I understand, and just learned this morning, also a graduate of Emory and Henry College, which is also is where I graduated from. However, I am disappointed that the majority rejected our request for 2 witnesses and limited our side to just 1 witness on a panel of 5 witnesses. Last Congress, we had 3 hearings with a 6-witness panel, and we had a January 2020 e-cigarette hearing with 2 witnesses representing Republican governors on a panel of 5 state government witnesses. So it seems the majority could have allowed our requested witness. I hope we can work in a more congenial way on witness panels going forward. Today's hearing can help us build on the important work that the Energy and Commerce Committee and the EPA have accomplished to date. Between 2015 and 2018, and Republicans were in the majority, we pushed bipartisan hearings and bipartisan legislative efforts on issues such as reducing carbon emissions, boosting renewable energy options, driving modernization and innovation within industry, pushing brownfields cleanup and redevelopment, increasing compliance for drinking water infrastructure, and improving compliance with ozone standards, just to name a few. I also want to highlight several of the EPA's key accomplishments over the past 4 years. For example, the agency focused on brownfields and Superfund contaminated sites, and in so doing, delisted 82 sites from the national priorities list. In fiscal year 2020 alone, the EPA was able to delete 27 sites from the list, the most in nearly 20 years. And since 2017, emissions of the 6 criteria air pollutants dropped 7% overall by the end of 2019, and unhealthy days for sensitive groups dropped by 34%. The EPA took steps to champion recycling and combat marine debris. The EPA invested in America's clean water and drinking water infrastructure, updated the lead and copper rule, provided a comprehensive approach for reducing lead in drinking water, and implemented the Affordable Clean Energy Rule, which will reduce emissions from coal-fired power plants. These are just a few examples of the accomplishments achieved by the federal government over the past 4 years to help further the mission of the agency. With this foundation, we should examine broad questions on the EPA's future. What should be the mission of the EPA? If the EPA mission is to be changed, That discussion begins in this committee, and Congress determines that change. Is the EPA effectively carrying out its mission? The committee should make that determination. What are the EPA's most serious and complex challenges? Can the agency's current structure, operations, and culture meet these challenges? When making such determinations and inquiries, we would of course want to hear from former EPA administrators and former senior EPA officials. But the success of EPA's actions do not depend just on agency employees, but on compliance by the regulated sector and the confidence of the public. EPA regulators should treat most regulated parties as partners in improving the environment. As a former EPA administrator, William Riley stated, quote, respect for those most affected and inconvenienced by EPA rules and regulations is critical to winning the country's trust in the EPA. However, in winning public confidence, it is essential that EPA regulators have a realistic and fact-based understanding of the extent that our nation's power-based load is still reliant on fossil fuels. The real-world impact of EPA's regulatory decisions should be understood. Section 321 of the Clean Air Act calls for the EPA to evaluate the cumulative employment impacts of Clean Air Act regulations. It is critical that fossil fuel workers and their communities are included in these evaluations. The EPA, while striving to fulfill its mission, should pay close attention to all aspects of public health, including mental health, because stripping away the generational livelihood from thousands of Americans kills people. It kills families and it kills communities. Protecting the environment and promoting an innovative economy are not mutually exclusive ideals. It doesn't have to be a clean environment or jobs. It can be both. I hope today's discussion is a step for us to find common ground and ways to ensure that the EPA does not ignore impacts on working men and women. I look forward to our discussion today and to learn more about how the EPA can perform more efficiently, effectively, and meet the challenges ahead. Thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. The chair now will recognize the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes for purposes of an opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is a very important hearing. Thank you for holding this. Obviously, we're very concerned about not only the EPA, but many other agencies that fall under our jurisdiction that had some major cutbacks. And in my opinion, we're not able to function effectively in the last 4 years. But the EPA is probably the worst in that respect because of after 4 years of attacks, it's essential that we have a robust and effective and fully resourced EPA. It's not going to be easy. In the last 4 years, President Trump's EPA undermined key public health protections, including common sense limits on pollution from power plants, successful automobile efficiency standards and protections that keep American families safe from mercury and other toxic hazards. They let polluters off the hook by weakening the enforcement program. They eroded the essential scientific infrastructure, and they sidelined and silenced the agency's career staff as scandals and investigations captured headlines on an almost daily basis. So thankfully, it's a new day at the EPA. The Biden administration has hit the ground running and taken decisive action to get EPA and its mission back on track. On day one, President Biden reasserted our international climate leadership by rejoining the Paris Climate Accord. Shortly thereafter, he signed a broad range of additional executive actions to reverse the Trump administration's dangerous rollbacks and address the climate crisis, while also pursuing economic justice and economic revitalization. And as our witnesses today can attest, EPA's record of accomplishments over the years has shown that protecting the environment and public health is not only good policy, but also good for the economy and jobs. And I want to stress that, and that'll be my questions today as well, that it makes sense that the president's early actions on the environment are also an important part of his jobs agenda. So recognizing that environmental injustices have historically been concentrated in poorer communities, President Biden assigned new duties to EPA to strengthen enforcement of protections, environmental justice communities. He also required the agency to improve monitoring and provide real-time pollution data to the public, and he established the Justice 40 initiative with the goal of delivering 40% of overall benefits of federal investments to environmental justice communities. And these are key steps, but they're not enough on their own. Congress has to act to ensure EPA has the right resources and tools in place to succeed, and that science is always at the heart of public policy. So just last week, the committee introduced the Clean Future Act, ambitious legislation to combat the climate crisis this decade and achieve net zero greenhouse gas pollution. It's critical that we act as more and more Americans have been forced to confront the harsh realities of climate change. Now, I wanted to mention that our former governor from New Jersey, Kristy Whitman, is here with us. Thank you for being here, Governor. I said that I always say she's my favorite Republican governor. As you know, she was the EPA administrator, and she worked with me to establish with this committee a long time ago, I shouldn't say, the Brownfields Initiative. Some of you were already talking about that. It was when she was the EPA administrator, and she took the idea from what she did as governor in New Jersey, because we had more brownfield sites than any other state in the country. And this was done with President Bush. It was bipartisan. We had the signing ceremony together. So, it's just another example of how we can work on a bipartisan basis, which was what Governor Whitman was always about and still is about. But she also knows that, the devastating impact of these extreme weather events. You remember, Governor, after Superstorm Sandy in 2012, it took years for the economy, families, and communities to recover from that event or for any extreme weather event. I'm at the shore with a lot of my district, and we see the consequences of these extreme weather events. So our witnesses this morning truly know what's at stake. They've served under Democratic and Republican presidents, both at headquarters and in regional offices. They're uniquely qualified to share their opinions on how to get back on track with the EPA and how Congress can help the EPA tackle the enormous environmental challenges that confront us. So with that, Madam Chair, I yield back, but I can't stress how important this hearing is, and obviously that we follow up with whatever we can to recreate a robust environmental protection agency. Thank you, Chairwoman DeGette.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. And the chair will now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Ms. McMorris-Rodgers, for 5 minutes for the purpose of an opening statement.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair DeGette. Thank you, all of our panelists, for being here this morning. This is an important hearing. I appreciate you bringing us together. EPA's core mission is to protect human health and the environment. This mission is bipartisan. We all want clean air, soil, and water. Our oversight of the EPA should be central to ensuring the agency strives to improve people's lives. Unfortunately, today is not about oversight. It's about politics. If we want real oversight of the EPA, we need to hear from those who can testify about the direct effects of heavy-handed regulation, especially for the American worker. Our hearing should not be so tilted towards the opinions of political appointees and alumni. We need to hear about what is actually happening today, what the facts are, what the science is. President Biden promised trust and transparency when he took office, yet his EPA priorities remain a secret. The American people deserve answers. Rather than hold a hearing to score political points, we should be hearing from current officials so that we can get those answers. Mr. Deskins, I'm thankful that you're here to lend your expertise on how the left's rush to green will hurt America's energy reliability, affordability, and national and economic security. I'm disappointed that the majority prevented us from a more balanced panel. Congressman Kelly Armstrong's constituent, Mr. Carol Dewing of North American Coal, was willing to offer a unique on-the-ground perspective, but he was not allowed to testify. If he were allowed to do so, we would have heard about the real lost jobs and lost wages caused by President Biden's executive orders. I'm disappointed that the majority decided to silence such an important voice. For too long, the left has pursued unworkable climate policies that destroy jobs, put our economic growth at risk, and cede our global power to China. In contrast, President Trump demonstrated that you can pursue environmental protection while having economic growth. Under President Trump, we experienced the cleanest air in recorded history. In 2019, the US had the largest absolute decline of energy-related carbon emissions of any country in the world. And it was driven by American innovation, not Green New Deal style mandates or other economy-altering solutions offered by our Democratic friends. The Trump administration made great strides in addressing legacy pollution too. In fact, in the 4 years, the Trump EPA delisted and removed the same number of sites from the national priorities list as the Obama-Biden administration did in 8. The Trump EPA also assisted vulnerable communities with hundreds of millions of dollars for cleanup, job creation, and economic development through brownfields grants. Because of Republican leadership, we saw over the last 4 years significant efforts to provide Americans with clean air, soil, and water. My sincere hope was that President Biden would not return to the standard top-down, heavy-handed playbook and ignore the science and results that show a clean environment can be compatible with economic growth and job creation. On his first day in office, President Biden canceled the Keystone XL Pipeline. He put thousands of workers out on the street without a job in the middle of a pandemic. As the head of the AFL-CIO put it, quote, "I wish he hadn't done that on the first day, because it did and will cost us jobs." Building on that disastrous decision, President Biden paused oil and gas drilling on public lands. With just a few strokes of the pen, President Biden's actions weakened our nation's energy security while doing little to actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It's a climate plan that makes America energy dependent on others and benefits the Chinese Communist Party. This is not how America leads to win the future. Rather than focus on punitive regulatory actions, we should incentivize American ingenuity and leadership to solve our environmental and energy issues. We can address climate change risk through innovation, conservation, adaptation, and preparation, so families have reliable and affordable energy too. Let's work together to reduce barriers, to unleash American innovation for new technologies and capabilities to solve not only our environmental challenges of today, but of the future. Thank you, and I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. The chair now asks unanimous consent that the member's written opening statement be made a part of the record. Without objection, so ordered. I'd now like to introduce our witnesses for today's hearing. First, we have the Honorable Todd Whitman, Administrator of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency from 2001 to 2003. The Honorable Carol Browner, Administrator of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency from 1993 to 2001. Gwendolyn Fleming, former Chief of Staff and Region 4 Regional Administrator of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Wendy Cleland-Hamnett, former Principal Assistant Administrator of the Office of Chemical Safety and Pollution Prevention of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. And now I'd like to introduce Mr. McKinley to introduce the Republican witness, Dr. Deskins. Mr. McKinley, you need to unmute. You're on mute. You're still on mute.
There, I'm technologically challenged, so I'm sorry, Madam Chairman. But let me introduce Dr. Deskin. Dr. Deskin is the Assistant Dean at West Virginia University's Business School and is also the Director of West Virginia University Bureau of Economics and Economic Research and the Associate Professor of Economics. Last year, or actually each year, Dr. Deskin publishes a West Virginia Economic Outlook report that is widely distributed. His work has been utilized by business leaders and policymakers all across America. Dr. Deskin has previously testified before Congress on the importance of innovative, energy-related opportunities to achieve economic growth. And I welcome him back for today's discussion. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. Now, I'm sure everybody's aware the committee's holding an investigative hearing, and when we do so, we have the practice of taking testimony under oath. Does anyone have an objection to testifying under oath today? Let the record reflect the witnesses responded no. The chair then advises you that under the rules of the House and the rules of the committee, you are entitled to be accompanied by counsel. Does any witness request to be accompanied by counsel today?
No.
Let the record reflect the witnesses responded no. So if you will, please raise your right hand so I can swear you in. Do you swear that the testimony that you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Let the record reflect the witnesses have responded affirmatively, and you're now under oath and subject to the penalty set forth in Title 18, Section 1001 of the United States Code. The chair will now recognize our witnesses for 5-minute summaries of their written statements. There's a timer on the screen that you can see that will count down your time, and it'll turn red when your 5 minutes has come to an end. I'm now very pleased to recognize Governor Whitman for 5 minutes. Governor.
Thank you. I want to thank the chair and the ranking member for giving me this opportunity to speak today about some of the challenges facing the Environmental Protection Agency in the early years of the Biden administration. Since its founding in 1970, EPA has made an enormous difference in America's quality of life. Our air is cleaner, our water is pure, our land is better protected, and our citizens are leading better lives, healthier lives because of the work of the EPA. In addition, EPA has shown, as many of the spokespersons have already acknowledged, that environmental protection and economic prosperity go hand in hand, and that safeguarding our environment also pays economic dividends through the advancement of technology and the creation of jobs. In recent years, EPA has suffered under the leadership of people who seem neither to understand nor appreciate the vital role that the EPA plays in American life. It's an issue that has become a major challenge for all of us. The basic recognition that good science is the foundation of good policy has been eroded. The morale of the EPA's dedicated career servants has plummeted. Important policies have been rolled back or gutted, not because of new scientific findings, but rather to appease powerful interests. All this has both undermined the work of the EPA and has contributed to the loss of confidence by the American people in government in general. I am encouraged, however, that President Biden's nominee for EPA Administrator, Michael Regan, has the experience and the expertise and credibility to restore people's faith in the EPA. Mr. Regan and I have discussed at some length the challenges and the opportunities he will face should he be confirmed, and I certainly hope that he will be. The first order of business for the new leadership at the EPA is to reestablish a commitment to sound science as an integral and indispensable part of policymaking. Fortunately, I expect that under the new administration, science will occupy its proper place. Coupled with a return to science as a basis for the policy decisions is the restoration of the morale of the people at EPA. Over the years, the agency has been fortunate to be able to attract some of the finest scientific and policy talent available. Yet recent studies showed that between 2016 and 2020, EPA lost 672 scientific experts. That's enormously troubling. EPA must be able to retain the expertise it has while also attracting the best of the rising generation, those who will commit their careers to the agency and its mission. That's the only way that the agency can meet the many environmental challenges that it faces. The most pressing of these, of course, is climate change. Climate change has become a political football, and that's wrong. After all, the measures we need to address climate change make sense, both for the environment and for public health, no matter what one thinks about climate change. Reducing carbon emissions, moving away from fossil fuels, expanding renewable energy, reducing the emissions of methane and volatile organic compounds, and reviewing and revisiting many of their air rules put in place during previous administrations all make sense, whatever one's position on the threat of climate change. They also make sense not only because they will help reduce the threat of climate change, but also because they will help improve the quality of the air we breathe and will improve human health. That is a worthy and urgent pursuit in and of itself. The next thing that we have to address is environmental justice. I was pleased that President Biden is bringing into the White House an effort to advance environmental justice priorities. Leadership from the White House will make a huge difference. The health and safety of people who live near polluting generating facilities must be better protected. And working with state and local governments, EPA must do a better job in preventing the location of such new facilities in places that lack the potential the political or economic clout to protect their communities and its residents. EPA must also continue its efforts to identify emerging chemicals of concern and put in place regulations that safeguard the environment and human health. EPA must also tackle the enormous deficiencies in our water infrastructure. America's aging water infrastructure wastes nearly 6 billion gallons of treated drinking water every day through leakage. Another 2 trillion gallons of drinking water are lost due to water main breaks. In addition, as many as 6.1 million homes in the United States are connected by lead service lines to the drinking water mains that serve their neighborhoods. Ingesting lead at any level is unsafe, especially for children. This must be eliminated. Members of the subcommittee, over the past 4 years, EPA and its mission have suffered. But EPA is resilient because its people are dedicated and determined to carry out its mission with scientific integrity and unwavering commitment. I'm optimistic that with the help of this committee, EPA will be able to continue its critical role for the future of the health of the United States. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Governor. I'm now pleased to introduce Administrator Browner for 5 minutes. Administrator, you need to unmute.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Madam Chair and Ranking Member, for the invitation to be here. And Mr. Chairman, it is wonderful to see you. And I think we also have, I know Kathy Castor was here, a fellow Floridian, joining the hearing today. And to all of you who have been longtime supporters of EPA, it is a pleasure to be with you. And I join Governor Whitman in encouraging the Senate to move rapidly to confirm Michael Regan. I think he will be a wonderful leader of the agency. I also want to just thank all of the career staff, the professional staff at EPA. These are people who have worked year in and year out, sometimes under very difficult circumstances, to do their part to protect the air we breathe and the water we drink. And I thank them for their commitment. In December, EPA celebrated its 50th anniversary. This is an agency created by a Republican president, Richard Nixon. The first head of EPA, Williams Ruckelshaus, is a widely recognized environmental leader, business leader, ethical, moral, a really wonderful man. Unfortunately, we lost him not too recently. But he really charted a course for the agency, an important course. And I think that continues to be the course we should follow. And essentially, there are sort of 4 parameters I would suggest that a modern EPA should operate under. 1, follow the science. 2, the law. 3, enforcement. 4, environmental justice. If those are the cornerstones of how EPA thinks about its work on a day-to-day basis, then it will be able to serve all Americans. And by all Americans, I mean not just people in communities, I mean the business community, who is essential to doing the work to reduce our pollution. So it means bringing everyone together. As you heard, I spent 8 years running the Environmental Protection Agency. It makes me the longest serving administrator. I started the afternoon the president was sworn in, and I left the night before the next president was sworn in. I think it'll be a hard record to break, but I'm very proud of our record. Mr. Chairman Pallone and Governor Whitman, congratulations to you all on Brownfields. You know, we took a nascent idea from a state. We spent a little bit of money while I was at EPA, but you guys made it real. And it proves that states are a good place to find ideas. And I encourage the current EPA to look at states. We created the Drinking Water SRF Fund. So today, states receive money every year to enhance their drinking water protections. We cleaned up more than 600 Superfund sites, and we set the first ever fine particle standard upheld by the Supreme Court, 9-0, with Justice Scalia writing the majority opinion. And finally, we embraced the issue of climate change. The legal memorandum we wrote became the basis for the Massachusetts versus EPA decision, which is what is relied on today by the agency to regulate greenhouse gases. So there is a lot of authority that is sitting there that can be used by the agency to meet the challenges of today. When EPA started its work, we had rivers on fire, we had cities so polluted you couldn't see from one building to another. Today, as everyone has noted, we have made real progress. Yes, the air is cleaner, the water is safer. The job is not done, but we also face a new challenge, and a very severe challenge, and that is the challenge of climate change. And so as this committee and the rest of the Congress thinks about the role of EPA, I hope you will think about it in terms of its history, but also in terms of the challenges in front of us. In terms of enforcement, which one of you mentioned, I think, I apologize, a member mentioned, I agree. Enforcement is about compliance. It is about getting companies to do the right thing. It is also a fairness. If I comply with an environmental regulation and my competitor doesn't, that's a basic unfairness. I'm spending money to achieve an environmental endpoint that they're not spending about. So we need to think about enforcement in conjunction with compliance. I agree with what was said. Finally, I want to talk a moment about environmental justice. Communities of color, poor communities suffer disproportionately the burdens of our modern industrial society. They will suffer disproportionately the impacts of climate change. And I am very, very heartened by all of the work that is being done or has been launched in the Biden administration to address the realities. As we transition our economy to meet the challenge of climate change, we must do so in an environmentally just manner. The final thing I will say, in my 8 years, we were roundly recognized as being very aggressive in terms of setting public health standards, in terms of enforcing those standards, and I will note the economy grew. We do not have to choose between a healthy environment and a healthy economy. Thank you all so much for the opportunity to be here.
Thank you so much, Administrator Browner. I'm now pleased to recognize Ms. Keys Fleming for 5 minutes. You'll need to unmute.
Here we go.
Thank you.
Good morning. Chair DeGette, Ranking Member Griffith, Chairman Pallone, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. My name is Gwen Keys Fleming, and I appreciate the opportunity to testify today. EPA is an agency that I know well, having spent 5 years there, first as the regional administrator in Region 4, the Southeastern region, and then as Chief of Staff. The views that I express here today are my own and are based on those experiences. During my tenure with the agency, I had the great honor and privilege to work alongside thousands of dedicated public servants, both career and political, who worked tirelessly to advance the agency's mission to protect public health and the environment. Today, EPA faces a long list of complex, urgent, and necessary actions, including addressing climate change and environmental justice. Alarmingly, EPA has to meet these threats with fewer real resources than the agency had in the 1980s. The decline happened despite our population increasing 44% and total government discretionary spending decreased by 48% over that same time. EPA spending, in terms of real dollars, is less than half of what the agency spent nearly 30 years ago. This steady funding decline has adversely affected EPA's ability to meet its mission and the growing demand for protections in communities around the country. In addition, it is also adversely affecting the agency's state and tribal partners who rely on EPA for grants and technical funds to support their operations. Programs and fundings, however, cannot be effectively utilized without the agency's greatest asset, the people, its employees. Unfortunately, staffing declines have made the tightened budget situation even worse. Today's staffing levels are at a 30-year low. Not only does EPA need to recruit and hire the next generation of environmental professionals, but the agency needs to do so with an eye towards diversifying its ranks and its leadership. In addition to having sufficient resources to do the job, the agency will be most successful when it remains true to the following 5 guideposts, some of which my co-panelists have mentioned before. First, follow the science. Science has been and needs to continue to be the foundation of EPA's decision-making and actions going forward. To be well-positioned to address emerging areas of science, EPA needs additional financial resources, staffing, and scientific equipment to ensure that its scientists can connect to the newest and best research, as well as up-to-date information technology to access the vast data sets relevant to the various complex issues the agency will face. Second, follow the law. In addition to following and enforcing the requirements of the over 20 major environmental laws, EPA must also identify more ways to utilize Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act as part of its suite of legal tools to provide for redress for discriminatory actions and disparate impacts in the environmental space. Third, provide transparency in its decision-making. To further build and maintain EPA's trust, or build trust in EPA's actions, the agency needs to be transparent in its decision-making process. This means making its data sets available in ways that can be easily understood by the public. Fourth, engaging all stakeholders. Successful, large-scale environmental protection requires engaging EPA's partners and stakeholders. This means having conversations with states, tribes, local governments, and the regulated community throughout the process and early in the process. Stakeholder engagement is especially critical in meeting the urgent needs of environmental justice communities overburdened by pollution and suffering under the vestiges of environmental racism. Lastly, synergize resources to maximize impact. To augment protection and services to communities, EPA needs funding to institutionalize integrated strategies and remove the silos across the program offices. There are several successful projects, including the Regenesis Project and CUP, that the agency can use as models in this regard. I want to finish by expressing my deep appreciation to the dedicated public servants at EPA and the work that they're doing to keep our air and water safe and clean. I also want to thank Congress for its attention to these issues, and I look forward to the discussion today.
Thank you so much, Ms. Fleming. I'm now pleased to recognize Ms. Cleland-Hamnett for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks to the ranking member and the distinguished members of the subcommittee for providing me with the opportunity to participate in today's hearing on restoring the vital mission of the Environmental Protection Agency. I'm honored to appear with the other very distinguished members of this panel. I completed a 38-year civil service career at the EPA when I retired in 2017, and I had the privilege of serving in 7 different administrations, or under 7 different administrations under both parties. As the chair mentioned, I became the principal deputy assistant administrator for the Office of Chemical Safety and Pollution Prevention in 2016, and I was the acting assistant administrator beginning in January 2017 until I retired September 2nd of that year. I'm here today to provide the perspective of a career employee and senior program manager at the EPA. As all of the former witnesses and the opening remarks have noted, the EPA has an incredibly important mission to protect public health and the environment. And accomplishing that mission is difficult and complex. Essential to human health and environmental protection is the need for the EPA's work to be moved forward at pace. While risks are being analyzed and actions developed, potential threats remain unaddressed. There is a challenging balance to be maintained between the desire for thoroughness and the need to provide public protection. Important actions which have been stopped or delayed in recent years will need to be restarted or accelerated. I also agree with many others who've spoken this morning that the EPA's greatest strength is its career staff. It's my belief that the agency staff have unparalleled expertise in the science, legal, and regulatory frameworks necessary to achieving continued progress in protecting human health and the environment. That said, I am very concerned that this key strength of the EPA, its career workforce, has been eroded. When the legal and scientific views of career staff are dismissed, or if career staff are cut out of policy and technical discussions at the political level, a great resource is lost, and the agency's credibility suffers as a result. Their lack of participation also raises concerns about political interference and the undue influence of special interests. And although there remain very many very dedicated and qualified staff at the EPA, a concerted effort at hiring is needed to replace staff members who have been lost in recent years to retirement and other departures, and to ensure adequate staffing in priority areas and new and emerging areas that the agency will need to address. And to do their jobs as they should, staff must have the appropriate resources, data, and infrastructure to support them. Sound, credible, and transparent science is vital to the agency's credibility and effectiveness. Scientific peer review is a cornerstone of credibility for EPA science, and for that matter, scientific work in general. Those most qualified and knowledgeable in the scientific issues of interest should be recruited to participate in transparent and balanced peer review panels. Political interference to omit or include certain peer review participants erodes the credibility of the process. Likewise, the dismissal of pertinent and vetted scientific information in decision-making in order to support a particular policy outcome is inappropriate and treads the credibility of those policy decisions. When policies for the use of data are developed with the participation of scientists and the public and are applied transparently by decision makers, credibility is greatly enhanced. My last job at the EPA was to help steer my program in the agency through another change of administration. I quickly learned, however, that my advice was not wanted and that the process for making policy decisions was not open to career staff, and an effort began to stop programs and drastically reduce resources. I was angry and saddened by this and felt that I could not continue to be a part of what was going on, and I retired. Although I am no longer at the agency, I have to believe that the atmosphere over the last several years has been corrosive. It is my sincere hope that the agency and its mission can be rebuilt and revived. I commend the subcommittee for its interest in rebuilding the mission of the EPA, and I thank you again for the opportunity to participate in this hearing.
Thank you so much. We appreciate your perspective. Dr. Deskins, I'm now very pleased to recognize you for 5 minutes for your opening statement.
Chairwoman DeGette, Chairman Pallone, Ranking Members Griffith and Rogers, and members of the committee, thank you so much for inviting me to appear before you today to discuss the future and mission of the EPA. I begin by acknowledging that I have never worked for the EPA and I have no insight into the agency's inner workings. Rather, I'm here to speak to the importance of ensuring that the future EPA fully studies any potential economic impacts associated with policies under consideration. It's imperative to fully weigh the cost of any policies that might affect fossil fuel usage against the policy's benefits. And for policies that are ultimately deemed to move forward despite generating an adverse impact on communities reliant on coal and gas, those costs should be fully highlighted. This acknowledgement will help promote investments in those areas to help the affected people and communities survive an economic shock and ultimately thrive. The point that I stress isn't new by any means. For instance, Section 321 of the Clean Air Act requires that the EPA conduct employment impact analyses as part of its policy analysis program. I want to illustrate the economic hardship that many coal-producing communities have endured over the past decade or so. I come here from West Virginia, a state which by any objective measure is an energy state. Just for example, energy accounts for 14% of economic output in the state, making it the state's largest industrial supersector. Energy jobs are among the highest paying jobs in the state, often by far. Coal and natural gas are two of our key export commodities. And severance tax revenue from coal and gas is important to our state to fund local governments, state and local governments, and public schools and many other public services. The deep decline in coal production in recent years, combined with a lack of industrial diversification, has had a devastating effect on our state's economy. Coal production has fallen by about 1/2 from its 2008 high, and this has led to a loss of about 15,000 coal jobs and a direct loss of $3.5 billion in economic output in our state. These losses ignite a vicious cycle where we see outmigration of primarily our younger men and women. Then we see an aging population. Then we see drug abuse pop up, and so on. This makes it even more challenging to attract new business to our affected areas, thus perpetuating this vicious cycle. Some may read the numbers associated with declining coal output and imagine that the losses are spread across the entire coal-producing region of our nation. We have seen a national drop in the demand for coal, but the effect of that drop in demand has been felt most strongly in Central Appalachia, including Southern West Virginia and Southwestern Virginia. The concentration of these job losses created a Great Depression in 6 Southern West Virginia counties. At one point over the past decade, payrolls contracted at rates between 25 and 33% in each of these 6 counties. In addition, despite the observed bounce back in coal between 2017 and 2019, employment levels have increased only slightly for many of these struggling areas. Consider Boone County, for example, which had been the state's largest coal-producing county for many years. Their coal production and employment stand at around 20% of its level a decade ago. Statistics show as well that other job losses in the county are occurring as less money is flowing to local businesses like restaurants, entertainment venues, etc. Losses in coal severance tax revenue in these counties have led to severe public school layoffs. The industrial mix in these counties also lends to the crisis. In Boone County, for example, in 2010, coal accounted for 55% of all the jobs in the county, making it difficult, if not impossible, for many laid-off coal miners to just go out and find other jobs locally. My point is the heavy concentration of losses in coal output and employment make it far worse than would have been the case if the losses were widely dispersed. The current situation, honestly, it gives rise to the question of whether many of these affected communities are even sustainable in the long run. Are these communities altogether sustainable given the suffering that we've seen? Many call for industrial diversification as a solution to West Virginia's economic crisis. I myself make this call routinely in speeches across the state, weekly practically. It's crucial for West Virginia to cultivate strength in other industries like manufacturing and tourism, but industrial diversification is a long-term and multifaceted proposition. A more viable path for West Virginia in the short term is through maintaining our state's energy sector. While many factors affecting energy in West Virginia and similar areas are outside of the reach of policymakers, I hope that the information provided today can help make for a better policy to move West Virginia and similar communities forward. Again, I urge you, finally, to ensure that a future EPA fully considers statistics like these that describe how coal communities in West Virginia and other parts of rural America are affected when fossil fuel jobs disappear. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Deskins. It is now time for the members to ask questions, and the chair will recognize herself for 5 minutes. Ms. Cleland-Hamnett, you said you worked at the EPA over 7 administrations. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And so you worked under both of the former administrators who are sitting here today. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
And I've got to say, I worked with both of those administrators too in my many years in Congress, and always with the goal of protecting Americans' health and protecting our environment. I'm really struck by what someone like you says, because you were there so long under Democratic and Republican administrations, really doing the work of the agency. And several times you said that that one of the things you think needs to happen is that political influence needs to be taken out of the agency. Is political influence a problem that you've seen throughout your tenure, your long tenure at the EPA, or just in the last years of your time there?
Well, first, if I could, let me just clarify that I think it's inappropriate political interference to which I was referring. I think it's totally appropriate that there's political influence. That's why we have political appointees, presidential appointees, and others to help carry out the president's mission.
Right.
Yes.
What's inappropriate? What would you say is inappropriate political influence?
Well, I think it's when processes for producing sound science, credible science, transparent science are either ignored altogether or changed in a way that lessens their credibility or their effectiveness. I think it's when legal arguments about how best to interpret statutes and responsibilities of the agency are essentially ignored, or career staff just aren't given the chance to present that kind of information, and it's not given due consideration.
Thank you. Now, Governor Whitman, one of the things that really struck me both in your written testimony and what you said today is the importance of relying on science. Do you think if we get back to a reliance on science, that can help us with the morale at the agency and help us recruit some new fresh faces there?
I think without question, the fact that so many times the science was stifled not for policy reasons so much as political has been really eroded the confidence. And there's a lot that Congress can do actually to help with ensuring the transparency, that ensure that there's some guidelines that are laid down within all the agencies that have to do with science as to what is appropriate political interaction, keeping track of that and letting people know what's going on, because there's always policy and politics is part of policy, but science should be the underpinning for any of the policy decisions. They shouldn't at the end of the day be purely political decisions.
Now, Administrator Browner, you were at the agency longer than anybody else. Would you agree with that assessment?
Yeah. Science is at the base of everything that EPA does. I mean, it really, I used to say the science made me do it. The agency, whether the career staff or the political appointees, is not free to do whatever. But having said that, it's important to remember that science is a process and science keeps asking questions. And so, the policies, the Clean Air Act directs EPA to make decisions on the best available science every 5 years, right? Because Congress rightfully recognized that science will keep going. If we hadn't made the decision, if our predecessors at EPA hadn't made the decision to ban lead in gasoline, which protected children, it wouldn't be banned today, because guess what? Science is still studying that. But what the agency was able to do was say there was adequate evidence, there was the weight of the evidence, and make a scientific determination. So
thank you so much. Thank you. So it seems to me, I was sitting here, obviously, if you had good science, you could take away inadequate political influence. Also, you need an adequate budget. I was looking at the statistic that half of the EPA has less in real dollars than it did in 1980. So that also seems to be a place where Congress could really step in, help recruit more science-based individuals, but also increase the budget appropriately. Would you agree with that, Administrator Browner?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay, thank you very much. My time's expired. I'm now delighted to recognize the ranking member, Mr. Griffith, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, and I appreciate the time. Ms. Cleland-Hamnett, I understand you're a lawyer, and I appreciated your comments about following the law. I think that's very important. Chairwoman DeGette and I talk about that on a fairly regular basis, coming from a legal background. But I have to say, under the Obama administration, I believe the EPA exceeded its statutory authority to justify several regulations, such as regulating emissions from truck trailers that don't have engines, claiming authority under the section of the Clean Air Act that deals with self-propelled motor vehicles. All the while they're going so far down that way to try to accomplish what they wanted, that some, and I note some in the EPA, or some in the administration, ignored warnings of high lead levels in drinking water from an EPA water scientist out in the field in Flint, Michigan. So I think we need to make sure that we're following the law and not following our wishes, whether it be a Republican administration or a Democrat administration. And I know that you would agree with me, and I'd give you a chance to answer, but I'm running out of time, and I've got to get to Dr. Deskins. Dr. Deskins, it's so good to have you with us today. Obviously, we share a lot in the region that I come from and the region you come from, originally having grown up in Honeacre. And if you were here, we would have talked ahead of time. I've got a great Honeacre story. Call me sometime. I'll tell you about it. But in your experience with the coal industry and in coal communities, are communities opposed to working out creative solutions to improve the environment that also allow for robust economic activity and affordable energy?
First and foremost, I'm always happy to get a question from a fellow Emory and Henry alumnus.
There you go.
But no, I don't think coal communities are opposed to this. But I mean, people just have to understand these coal communities, are faced with many challenges. Many of these areas are very remote, very rural. The terrain's very rugged. They face tremendous challenges around human capital, around education, training, health, drug abuse. And they're not opposed to working on alternative solutions, but in many cases, they need help from places like the federal government to help enable these changes to happen. And they don't need just cursory help. They need real significant help because their challenges are significant.
Things like the Coalfields Expressway, which would open up parts of West Virginia, southern West Virginia, and southwest Virginia, and connect a bunch of our interstates together. That would be very helpful. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, no, infrastructure is one of the key areas in which help is needed. Absolutely.
Because everybody says we've got to reinvent the economy, but when you have mountains and you don't have a lot of flat land and you don't have good roads, it's very difficult to do. I know you would agree with that. I want you to explain the coal severance, or the coal and natural gas severance tax, because that provides millions of dollars for things like education. And I'm not sure everybody on the committee understands that. And you mentioned it in your testimony. Could you elaborate a little bit and explain how that works?
Well, I mean, West Virginia, and I'm sure similar states across the country that rely on energy, have been, levying a severance tax on coal and natural gas and other items that are extracted from the ground for decades. I mean, in West Virginia, we have been heavily reliant on severance tax revenues for a long, long time. This funds state government in part, and it does fund a lot of local government activity in our state. And when severance tax revenue falls, it has a real impact on local communities. As I mentioned, when severance tax revenue falls, it presents a challenge for our public schools, for example, because they have less revenue to fund the services that we need.
Yeah, and that's a real problem in southwestern Virginia as well as West Virginia. And in fact, many people are surprised, as we talk about social justice and economic justice, that the district I represent, while not heavy in minorities, is 422nd in household income based on the latest data that we have available out of 435 congressional districts. That doesn't surprise you a bit, does it?
Oh, no. Of course not. I mean, I can go on all day about the poverty that exists in Central Appalachia even today. It's not as bad as it was in the 60s when the Johnson administration was working, but there's still tremendous poverty. In West Virginia, as I said, we had some counties in southern West Virginia that have been in a Great Depression because of just economic devastation. And there's a lot of poverty there. And my mission is to plead to try to find ways to get it addressed.
And so if we're talking about economic, environmental, and social justice, we need to make sure we don't leave out the communities of Central Appalachia as we go forward. You would not disagree with that either, would you?
There's nothing in the world that I could agree with more. I mean, I completely agree with that.
Well, last but not least, I think we've touched on a lot of it, and you and I could go on forever, but I will mention what a great opportunity I had to go to Emory and Henry. You obviously feel the same way. And it's a great little school that makes a difference in a lot of lives and ends up with professors talking to congressmen in the halls of Congress. And it's a great thing from southwestern Virginia. Thank you much, and I yield back.
Thank you.
I thank the gentleman. Chair now recognizes the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman DeGette. I wanted to start with Governor Whitman, if I could. In your testimony, you state that environmental protection and economic prosperity go hand in hand, and you further stated, and I quote, that safeguarding our environment also pays economic dividends through the advancement of technology and the creation of jobs. I know that you also talked about the return to science and retaining the scientists at the EPA. But then you also said that you were concerned that climate change can become a political football, but you suggest it doesn't have to be. So I just wanted to, if you could, tell us how developing solutions to address the climate crisis can also help support the economy, create jobs, because, we often hear from those who don't want to address climate change that, somehow this is going to be a net job loser, which I don't agree. So if you would comment on that, Governor, I'd appreciate it.
No, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I certainly do agree with you that it is not going to be a net loser. There are new technologies that will be developed. There are new energy sources that will be developed. But just let's think of the history for a second. In 40 years, almost 40 years, between 1980 and 2017, we saw our population grow by 4%. Our energy consumption grew by 25%. We drove 110% more miles which emitted more pollutions, and yet our GDP grew 167%, and yet we reduced our overall 6 criteria pollutions by 65%. I mean, that's more people creating more pollution, but we reduced it, but they were growing the economy at an extraordinary rate. That's what can happen when we talk about addressing things like climate change, because you're talking about some of the very basic elements that are negative as far as their impact on human health. When you talk about the emissions that drive climate change, where you're talking about carbon, you're talking about mercury, these things are having a real impact. And if you look also at the other side of it, which is the cost of climate change, as you well know from your shore communities, how devastated they become when we have these major storms that are now occurring. You know, you always used to talk about the 100-year flood. It now occurs every 5 years or 4 years. And every time you have that intrusion of salt water, you change the ecosystem. So the next time the storm comes in even further. And we have paid a huge price, not to mention the storms in California that we had last year, the fires, the devastation of the fires because of droughts. So we pay a huge price by ignoring this issue of climate change. Things we can do to harden ourselves against it. It doesn't mean stopping growth. It doesn't mean stopping the economy. It's finding better ways to grow and to address this issue.
Well, thank you. And Administrator Brown, I basically the question is along the same lines. If you would explain how a healthy economy and a healthy environment go hand in hand. I'm optimistic about all of this, and I know you are as well. I think you have to unmute.
Mr. Chairman, I join you in being optimistic. I don't believe we will be the first generation to pass on to another a problem they can't solve. It's not without its challenges. But I'd like to call attention to the private sector and how they're stepping up with new solutions and making large-scale investments, and how they can partner with the government to sort of drive the technology. You know, what we see out there, I mean, every day, and I'm sure this is true for other people, I get calls from people who invented something and it's been proven, it's a proven technology. They need to commercialize it. And so what we need is the private sector to start buying these new technologies, whether it's cement eating carbon, better lighting systems, better batteries for the grid, et cetera, et cetera. There's just so many opportunities out there. And I think if we all continue to put our mind together, we can both, as President Biden has called for, create a whole new generation of clean energy jobs. And I want to say to the professor who joins us here today, I take very seriously the realities for people in West Virginia and Kentucky and in Appalachia. But let's create a new generation of clean energy jobs. And with that, a new generation of solutions that will allow us to drive down the impacts of climate change while we grow the economy.
And I agree with you. And let me say too, I know that our ranking member, Ms. Rogers, constantly talks about China, and I appreciate that because I do think that China is a threat, and I do appreciate you're constantly mentioning China. But I also think this is a global competition, and China is investing in the new technology and making a lot of money with solar panels and others. So that's why we can't be left behind. We've got to meet that challenge as well from China, and this is a way to do it by moving on climate action. Thank you so much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
I thank the gentleman. And speaking of the ranking member, I'm now pleased to recognize Ms. Rogers for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Mr. Chairman. I appreciate those comments. I think my concern is that the approach that's being promoted right now by the majority and many Democrats is going to make us dangerously dependent upon China. When you consider that 90% of the solar panels, 80% of the windmills, they control 90% of the rare earth minerals. So that's where we need to make sure that we're not moving forward on policy that's only going to make us more dependent upon China. We need to celebrate that America is leading right now in bringing down carbon emissions. And we've done more than the next 12 countries combined. We need to be promoting new innovation. And we also need to make sure that as we are looking at all of these issues, that we are considering the job loss. And that's part of why I am really pleased that Dr. Deskins is with us today, can really talk about the real world impact of some of these policies. And thank you for your testimony, Dr. Deskins. You've spoken about the economic damage in Boone County due to aggressive environmental DC dictates. And Boone County used to be West Virginia's largest coal producing county. And now coal production and employment stands at less than 1/4, a quarter of 2010 levels. As places such as Boone County lose jobs, we're told that there are ways for these unemployed workers to transition without being left behind. So I'd like to ask you, where have the unemployed coal miners gone? And what are the new jobs that they are getting?
Thank you for that question. I really appreciate that question because it's so easy to say, oh, let's transition the laid off coal miners to new jobs. It's a lot easier said than done. That does happen to some extent, but to a large extent, it's very, very difficult for these people to make a transition. Imagine a laid off coal miner who's 50 years old, who's worked in the coal mines for 25 or 30 years, who only has a high school diploma or maybe even less. It's not easy to transition this person into a new position. Some people say something trivial like, oh, let's have the person start coding software. You know, things like that are not realistic. I mean, to make real opportunities to transition these people into new work requires real investment, like we said before, with infrastructure, with human capital, with fighting the vicious cycle that we have in place. Honestly, a lot of the people who are laid off coal miners haven't transitioned anywhere. They're just, to use, I don't know if I should use this word or not, but they're just floundering. And the area is in, is seeing a lot of economic hardship because that transition is so hard and so difficult. Much easier said than done.
Thank you. As a follow-up, through the years, I've heard from many people in Eastern Washington and across our state, actually, about the concerns over a lack of clarity of EPA regulations. You know, one example is the Washington Farm Bureau has stated that the clarity is critical in the waters of the USA rules, right? And when that rule was in front of us, the waters of the USA, it was difficult to understand what was covered, what is not. I wanted to ask if you would speak to the concerns and what you've seen around regulatory uncertainty, especially when it comes to conducting an adequate full job impact analysis.
I'm afraid my answer is going to be pretty short. I mean, unless you have clarity and fully understand the implications of a given policy, it's impossible to estimate the economic impacts associated with that policy. And that's all I have to say. I mean, I do economic impact analyses literally all the time. My office produces them constantly. And clarity in terms of fully understanding the policy in question is a step one necessity.
Yes. So would you speak to what you believe the EPA should be doing then to conduct that adequate economic impact analysis under Section 321 of the Clean Air Act to examine the effects of Clean Air Act regulations on jobs?
Well, I mean, cost benefit analysis and economic impact analysis are well established, methodological approaches in economics. I don't have any new techniques or any approaches. I mean, I would just urge for a full holistic consideration of the potential economic impacts and then transparency on what those impacts are after the fact. I know some of the earlier speakers spoke to the issue of transparency, and I would completely agree. Even when we move forward with a policy where the benefits exceed the costs, we still should be as transparent as possible about those costs. That will, if nothing else, help foster investment to promote transition over the long run. But holistic analysis and transparency, that's all I can ask for.
Yes, certainly that's very important. I appreciate you being with us. I'll yield back my time. Thank you.
Dr. Deskins, you'd be surprised at how much agreement you get on that on both sides of the aisle here in this hearing. Chair now is really pleased to recognize Ms. Custer for 5 minutes.
Great, thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you again to our panel and the insights. I should note that I started my Washington, D.C. career as an intern at the EPA back in 1976, so I'm dating myself. The EPA was new and I was new to all of it. One area where we know the EPA must take quick action is addressing PFAS and other forever chemicals. And in my state of New Hampshire, nearly half the population gets their water from private wells. And if PFAS chemical emissions seep into the ground and penetrate your well, families are at serious risk for exposure of this toxic chemical. We have increased levels of child cancer and other health impacts. In the southern part of New Hampshire's Merrimack Valley, several communities have had to deal with the aftermath of PFAS exposure. And some residents have had to rely on bottled water for drinking and cooking for years and must shower and bathe in water that they know contains PFAS. And on top of all this, the value of their homes declines dramatically until they're ultimately connected to utility water systems. This is no way for Americans to be living in the 21st century. And we need bold leadership at the EPA to clean up these contaminated sites and safeguard the American people. So last year, the House passed the PFAS Action Act, including my bill to turn off the tap on PFAS chemicals. For years, I've pushed the EPA to use its authority to protect families and hold contaminators accountable. And that's why I was so pleased to see the EPA issue 2 rules last month to put us on track to have PFAS drinking water regulations nationwide. This is so important. With more than 4,700 PFAS chemicals in commerce, it's abundantly clear we need to address this important issue. So Administrator Browner, let me start with you. In your testimony, you said strong public health protections are even more essential than ever. Can you elaborate on the need for public health protections and how PFAS fits into that goal?
Thank you, and I appreciate the question. You know, the role of EPA is to protect all Americans. And what that frequently means is let's protect the most vulnerable. And frequently that is children, that may be pregnant women, that may be Indigenous people, but that we need to really ensure that everyone is protected, not just some of the population. And so when I talk about strong public health protections, what I'm talking about is just that. That we set our standards based on the most at risk, because we know if we protect the most at risk, we're protecting everybody.
Great, thank you. And Ms. Cleland-Hamnett, I know you were deeply involved in efforts to reform the Toxic Substances Control Act. Does the EPA have the right authorities under this act or any other tools to effectively protect the public from PFAS contamination?
Yes, I think that the amendments to the Toxic Substances Control Act that were signed into law in 2016, if properly implemented and resourced and moved along at the right pace, could very much contribute to the agency's efforts to address PFAS chemicals. I think there's some very important authorities there to require further testing and monitoring of chemicals, to look at whether certain uses of chemicals and releases of chemicals from those uses and manufacturing are presenting significant risks. And for my former part of the agency that it implements TSCA to also work with the drinking water program and other programs and with the regional offices and the states to help provide the science and the information to make it possible to get these nationwide standards in place, and where it's appropriate to turn off the tap for some of these chemicals that are already in commerce, but that could be replaced by something less problematic, and to keep some of the newer ones. You know, even we've known about the problems of PFAS chemicals for a long time, but new ones have continued to come onto the market. So I think we need to look at that preventive aspect of it as well.
Well, I'll certainly be bringing the bill back on the turning off the tap. Just wondering, actually my time is up, so I will yield back, but thank you again for all your good work. Look forward to working with the EPA again. Thanks, Madam Chair, I yield.
I thank the gentlelady. Chair now recognizes Mr. Burgess for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Dr. Deskins, I noted in both your oral and your written testimony where you referenced problems that can occur in communities where the source of income is rapidly reduced, and you in fact mentioned drug abuse as one of the problems. And as you know, this committee focused a great deal of attention on that a couple of years ago. Now, unfortunately, with the pandemic, kind of taken our eye collective eye off that ball, but you bringing it back to us reminds me of just how important that is and how important the work that this subcommittee and the full committee did on the Support Act back in 2017 and 2018. In fact, Madam Chair, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to place into the record a Washington Post article from May of 2016 called "The Fentanyl Failure," where lack of attention to the growing fentanyl challenge resulted obviously in many, many deaths. And again, this committee did a great deal of work on that. And Dr. Deskins, I thank you for bringing it back to our attention. That is a very real social cost in the communities that are affected by the economic devastation of losing their primary source of income. Have you studied that to any great extent?
I've studied it to some extent, not to a great extent, but I mean, I can just say that West Virginia has been hard hit by the opioid crisis and by other problems associated with drug abuse. And it is a real tragedy that has affected our state in so many parts of the country. But one thing that's clear is that, the drug abuse problem is very multifaceted. There's not just one issue, but lack of economic opportunity is highly correlated with drug abuse. And we see in our counties where the economic opportunity is just diminishing and fading away. That's where the drug abuse crisis is the most severe.
So let me ask you your opinion, and I recognize I am asking for an opinion, but is it possible to achieve economic security and environmental progress without resorting to burdensome regulations?
Well, I mean, it's possible. I mean, it's hard to say in the generic sense. I mean, regulations just have to be, they have to be promoted with the best possible information, the richest possible information to underpin the decision making. They just have to be designed in an appropriate way. I mean, I think it is possible to achieve good environmental outcomes and good economic outcomes at the same time. It just depends on the nature of the regulations. They have to consider all the issues, and they certainly have to consider the economic suffering that I'm here to speak to. It just depends on the nature of the regulations.
So I don't think there's any argument that bad actors should be held to account, but is it important to have anything other than just punitive measures in the toolbox? Are there educational measures and educational responsibilities that the EPA should undertake?
Well, I think so, and I think is plus two. I mean, there's ways to include measures to help transition affected communities and help affected communities, move away from, maybe in some cases from fossil fuels to alternative energy sources. Cooperative action is very important and vital, and it needs to be undertaken. But I mean, we're not going to undertake cooperative action unless we really fully understand what's happening to the affected communities, which is one reason why I'm kind of preaching about the suffering that has plagued some places like in West Virginia.
And right, and of course, then the public's reaction in those areas affected, would they see only punitive measures which have extracted a significant social toll on those communities? Understandably, they're reticent to embrace other activities of the agency because they see firsthand how their communities have been hurt.
I agree.
All right. Well, let me ask you this.
I apologize if there was if I missed a question. I apologize, but I agree with your sentiment there. Absolutely.
Well, if recognizing environmental health is a priority, so if it is, given that, does it really matter how compliance standards are met? Is it okay for the agency to be as punitive as possible because it is just of such a burning importance that these environmental controls and environmental health be placed at such a priority?
Honestly, I don't know a whole lot about how the EPA has acted in the past in terms of taking cooperative measures or punitive measures. I would just kind of prefer for cooperative measures as a first option, as a first approach. But I can't really speak to the past, whether policies have taken one approach or the other, but I certainly prefer cooperation.
So as someone who's spent a lot of years doing constituent service, I will just tell you it's the punitive ones that get the public's attention. But I thank the chair, and I'll yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Chair now recognizes Ms. Rice for 5 minutes for questioning.
Thank you so much, Chairwoman DeGette. Before I came to Congress, I spent my life as a prosecutor. So in addition to having an enormous respect for the law, I have an even greater regard for those, how important it is to enforce the law, how incredibly important that is. I think it's especially true at the EPA. In order for the EPA to fully realize its mission, the protections can't just be on the books. They have to be enforced. And that enforcement is not just about ensuring compliance and holding polluters accountable. It's also going to have the impact of protecting the health of our communities and families and the environment. Governor Whitman, I'd just like to ask you about the task force that you recently co-led on the rule of law, which documented the importance of having an unbiased and fair administration of the law. The task force specifically observed that the awesome power of prosecution must be wielded without consideration of individuals' political or financial status or their personal relationships. Can you just elaborate on, why it's so important for the EPA to fairly and equitably apply the law, what obstacles there are for them doing that, and especially ignoring the status of any alleged violator, and that the potential impact that may have on.
Well, thank you, Congresswoman. That's a critical area. Obviously, if you don't have enforcement behind the regulations, they become meaningless. And so the agency has got to be able to do that. A lot of the discussion up to now has been around positive versus negative and carrot versus stick and how punitive they should be. The agency has to have the ability to enforce. Enforcement is critical to its mission. And as we said in the report, there are a number of steps that Congress can take to help ensure a transparency of when there is political interference, when there is an effort to try to stifle the enforcement. But the other side of it is, when I was there, we put in place a green and gold track. And for those companies that were doing better than environmental regulation or laws required, we helped them. We made things easier for them. We might not have investigated them every year and done it every other year, because every time you go in for inspections, that costs them money and time, and you recognize that. So there is this ability to strike a balance, and that's what the agency can do and has been good at doing, until you get sometimes political interference that says you either can't do any enforcement, or that's all you have to do.
Well, we would be well served to take your recommendations as a legislative body that you make. So, Administrator Browner, your testimony, you quoted, engaged, efficacious, and timely enforcement of EPA's regulations is essential to public health, environmental justice, and environmental and public health protection. Focusing on environmental justice, can you just expound more on that and why it's so important, the role that the EPA can play in that, especially if they have a robust and consistent enforcement program? You need to unmute.
Every American deserves equal protection under the environmental laws. Unfortunately, not every community and not every American is getting equal protection under the environmental laws. And one of the witnesses already spoke about using the Civil Rights Act, other tools that may be available to guarantee this, but enforcement is a piece of it. And, enforcement is not about a got you. It is about working with the company to bring them into compliance. And just like Governor Whitman mentioned, we had programs to do just that. We said, if you think you're in violation, please come into the agency. We will work in partnership with you to solve your problem. You get better compliance when you do that. When you're out there having to figure out if someone's out of compliance, sticking a probe in a smokestack, it's just a lengthy process, and it's complicated for everybody. I believe that the vast majority of companies want to comply, just like all of us stop at stop signs. But inevitably, there are those who don't stop at stop signs, and there are those who don't comply. And the enforcement there is important to ensure a level playing field and to ensure equal protection for communities.
Very quickly, Ms. Fleming, based on your experience, what resources and actions are necessary to ensure a strong and effective EPA enforcement program? You need to unmute.
First and foremost, making sure you have sufficient staff around the country and in the regions to be able to do the inspections to identify where the challenges are. Those inspectors and staff need the type of mobile equipment that has the latest innovation so they can have good, credible data upon which to make some of their decisions. And then obviously being able to post that information so it's transparently available to communities so they then can be informed and know how to advocate on their behalf.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank the gentlelady. Chair now recognizes Mr. McKinley for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. And I appreciate the fact and I'm encouraged that the committee today is going to be addressing the EPA's mission, because over the years, I think we've experienced mission creep that became a consuming force within the EPA. And quite frankly, the Trump administration, in fact, it was demonstrated during the Obama administration that it was all stick and no carrot. The Trump administration it concurs with your statement and trying to get it back to the basic mission. They spent the last 4 years trying to get back to the basics. What was the law? I had conversations with Scott Pruitt, same thing with Andrew Wheeler. Get back to the basics. What do we have to do? And he was successful with that. We've already heard over the litany of successes with it. The Superfund site updated the lead and copper rule, finalized air quality standards, created a funding mechanism so that we provided $100 million in grants. So without objection, Madam Chairman, I'd like to enter into the record the EPA's 2020 year in review and a document from Administrator Wheeler highlighting their net accomplishments.
Mr. McKinley, as stated, we will enter all of the exhibits at the end of the hearing.
Thank you. Thank you.
Have your staff provided to committee staff.
Thank you. So the question to Governor Wheeler, the Trump administration finalized a new lead and copper rule for the first time in over 30 years. When you were at the EPA, did you try to update that regulation? Ms. Whitman? My time's running. It's just continuing. Apparently.
Question addressed to me. It was cutting out badly. I couldn't hear. I apologize. I couldn't hear the
question. I lost the time on that. What we were saying was there was a new lead and copper rule that was put in place for the first time in over 30 years. So my question, when you were at the EPA, did you try to update that regulation?
Congressman, I don't even actually remember that, but yes,
Okay,
but I don't know. I honestly can't say whether we did or not.
Thank you. Do you know that that during the Obama administration worked on a lead rule for 8 years, but never proposed one? Under Trump, they did. They took care of it.
Well, that's good. We need that.
In the Flint, Michigan water crisis that happened under the Trump administration, did it happen under the Trump administration? Or was it Gina McCarthy and the Obama-Biden administration that took place that the water was so contaminated there? Do you know?
That was going on for a long time. I think there were several administrations.
Well, it happened under a lot of EPAs that ignored it, but it finally came to pass and it was corrected with it. Do you know back in 2015, the Gold King mine outburst out in Colorado, did that occur under a Trump administration to fix it? Or was it the Obama administration?
I presume, by the way you're asking the questions, that was under the Trump administration that was addressed. Okay, I mean, so, every administration has had their crises and addressed them.
Oh, yes, they have.
So it's good. I mean, we need that. Nobody is all bad, and that's the good
Governor, thing. Now, let me turn to Carol Browner. On page 2 of your testimony, you discussed the need to strengthen the environmental enforcement. But starting in 2011, there was a downward trend in all criminal enforcement statistics. It wasn't reversed until under the Trump administration. So were you aware of that it was declining, not increasing or not flat?
With all due respect, it is important to distinguish between civil enforcement and criminal enforcement. And I think that you need to look at both of the numbers.
Do you realize that the administration of the Trump administration actually collected twice as much in civil and criminal penalties than the Obama and Biden administration did? Were you aware of that?
I think the question is, what were the levels of compliance? What we all care about is the clean air and clean
It was a
water,
yes
not
or
the
no on
penalties.
that. So if I
Sir,
could,
not,
if I
sir,
could,
not the penalties, correct.
reclaim my time to go to John Deskin because the time's running out. John, Professor, the Democrats seem to be returning to the Obama's mission again, overwhelmingly focused on this war on coal as it relates to it. And they want to decarbonize this power sector by 2035. And without carbon capture, this would ultimately eliminate coal and natural gas for domestic energy production. And some you've already talked about what's going to happen with it. Can you discuss the potential impacts that eliminating that fossil fuel production would have on budgets, like in West Virginia or in Alaska, Wyoming, North Dakota, or Alabama, all the states that are involved with fossil fuels?
Do you mean if we just completely eliminated fossil fuels?
Well, that's what they're doing. That's the plan, to do away with it, because they're not funding carbon capture. So there's no way for us to get to net zero by 2035 unless we eliminate it.
Well, I certainly haven't analyzed the complete elimination, but that would be devastating for much of West Virginia. I mean, that would devastate our employment base. It would devastate our tax revenue base. If that happened, just hypothetically, if we had complete elimination over the next year, West Virginia would be devastated.
Just in closing, I know I'm running, but by 2030, they want to have 0 or 80% emission reduction of carbon. Are we going to be able to achieve that in West Virginia? 80% in the next by 2030?
No, I don't think we can achieve it in that short.
I hope the rest of the panel heard that, and we can go from there.
I
But thank you
thank
very
the
much. I appreciate
gentleman.
the time.
Chair now recognizes Ms. Schakowsky for 5 minutes.
I thank the chair. Can you hear me? I just want to thank both of our former EPA administrators. I think it is really great that you're here, and I think that we can learn and have been learning a lot from you. I have been very close to the workers and the union that works for the EPA in Chicago. And I want to tell you, these are people who love their jobs, but have been really demoralized in the last under the last administration by the loss of so many people, and also the ability to conduct some very vital public health initiatives that they needed to do, including enforcement. Of course, the COVID virus has interfered enormously. But I think that the greatest asset that we have, actually, and the greatest strength of the EPA is the talent and dedication of these career staff. So I wanted to ask Governor Whitman, in your testimony, you stated that, quote, in recent years, the EPA has suffered under the leadership of people who seem neither to understand nor appreciate the vital role that the EPA plays in Americans' lives. And you went on further to say, quote, the morale at the EPA is decided among the career civil servants has plummeted. And so I wondered if you could answer, why do you think that the morale has dropped so low?
Well, I think a lot of it has been due to the attitude of the previous administration toward the environment in general and to science and specifically, because EPA is a regulatory agency and those regulations are based on science, and when they are told and restricted in what science they can look at and what they can discuss, where they think, for instance, as has been mentioned in previous testimony, climate change is an enormous issue, but under the previous administration, they were not allowed to discuss it, not allowed to go to conferences where it might have been discussed. In fact, the words were taken down off the websites, and that made the scientists feel as if they were being totally ignored and restricted to a point where they were getting the message that science really wasn't important. And there are no clear parameters. And again, it's a place where Congress can be enormously helpful to the agency in ensuring that it develops rules, and this is true throughout government, where you have a clear transparency on where political interference is acceptable or not, and when you protect scientists who might come to conclusions that are not what the administration wants to hear necessarily, and then they get moved to someplace else. That's not what should happen. I mean, obviously, the administration takes that knowledge and does with it as it feels is appropriate for policy reasons, but they
Right,
shouldn't
thank you.
punish the scientists.
Let me move on to an old friend, Carol Browner. And it's great to see her. I wanted to ask you, what are the elements that make morale so important to the EPA? I'm thinking about things like recruitment and retention, and I wonder if you could speak to that.
Both recruitment and retention are hugely important. And part of how you achieve that is by making sure the agency is allowed to do its job, that it has a reputation for recognizing the professional experiences that people bring to the work. I think if there's and the governor just mentioned it, but in terms of the past administration, sort of the disregard for people's professional skills was, I think, significant, and that needs to be reinforced, and I know it will be under the new administration. But I think, people come to EPA because they want to do a particular type of work. They want to do a particular type of science. The politicals ultimately make a decision with that science, but allow the career professional staff to do their job, and it will be a great place for people to work, as it has been historically.
Thank you. My time has quickly expired. And
thank you, gentlelady. Chair now recognizes Mr. Long for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you all for being here today. I'd like to join my colleagues in acknowledging the tremendous work accomplished under the Trump administration's EPA. In particular, I want to highlight the progress made in reinvigorating the Superfund program, which handles cleanup of America's most contaminated sites. During the Obama administration, the EPA's neglect of this program resulted in 80 sites being added to the national priorities list. By comparison, the Trump administration's EPA, which had half the amount of time in office, removed 82 sites from the national priorities list, a historic achievement for this program. For the Americans who live and work near these sites, they were left unattended for the last 20 to 30 years. The Trump administration sent a clear message to them with their health and environment, that their health and environment mattered, and that somehow power wanted to lift the economic stigma surrounding Superfund sites. This is not a knock on the EPA's career officials at the Superfund office, but it is a clear example of how the Obama administration was too preoccupied with pursuing their big government climate change agenda while forgetting about the individuals affected by environmental policy. Dr. Deskins, your testimony mentioned how West Virginia has particularly been impacted by the environmental policy aimed at transitioning away from coal. Can you expand on what you see when these workers lose their jobs without receiving retraining for a new career?
Well, thank you for that question. The fact of the matter is it's very hard for many of these men and women to transition. Some people have to just move because, as I said before, these communities are often very rural, very small communities that are spread out here and there in a rugged mountainous landscape. It's not easy just to attract new businesses, especially not in the short term, to these areas. So many men and women have to move away. And for the ones who are there, honestly, many of them struggle over the long term to find a transition. I think ultimately to make that transition happen, we need to have much more robust investment from the federal government to help support things like we've mentioned before, like human capital investment and infrastructure investment.
Okay, and I'm going to stick with you, Dr. Deskin. Much has been said about the need to replace higher paying fossil fuel jobs with clean and green jobs. Do solar and wind jobs provide the same level of income and benefits as the fossil fuel jobs that they are meant to replace?
Honestly, I don't have all the information about solar and wind jobs, but I can say that coal jobs and natural gas jobs are very unusually high paying for based on the fact that they only require generally a high school diploma. I mean, you can have a high school diploma and go into coal or gas and make $80,000. It's almost impossible to find that kind of income, at least in West Virginia, anywhere else with that level of education and training. So I'm not for sure about the solar and wind side, but coal and gas jobs are unusually high paying.
What are the long-term economic impacts on communities, including the societal cost in communities where high-wage jobs are replaced with lower-wage jobs?
Like I said in my opening remarks briefly, I mean, there's a very severe negative economic impact for many West Virginia communities. And what we have is a vicious cycle that has been ignited in many of our communities where jobs leave. And so people have to out-migrate. The people who out-migrate are younger, healthier, better job prepared. When out-migration occurs, it makes the community less attractive to potential businesses. You throw drug abuse into the mix, which is very real. And we have this vicious cycle that is created. Tax revenues fall. That makes it harder for the communities to invest in infrastructure and public education and other public services. Honestly, we have some communities in West Virginia where it's not clear those communities will survive because of this vicious cycle and the devastating effect that it has.
I just returned a week, 10 days ago from Salt Lake City, a climate conference that several of us attended out there. And at the last day, we went up to Park City, Utah, and visited with the mayor there, where they're doing all they can. And they have all converted all their city buses over to 100% electric. And the mayor said that they're going to be carbon neutral by 2030, 9 years from now. And I posed the question to him. I said, well, where do you get your power now? What's it look like now? What was it 5 years ago, 10? Because, I mean, that's an admirable goal. Let's admit it. I mean, if you could be carbon neutral in 9 years. And he kind of looked down at the floor and looked back up and he said, well, he said, right now our power company is 85 to 90% fossil fuel. So everyone wants clean air, clean water, clean soil, but we have to be realistic, I think, in our approach, and thinking that you could be carbon neutral when you're 85, 90% fossil fuel right now in 9 years may be a little bit out of the realm of possibilities. But again, thank you all for your time today. Thank you for being on the panel. And Madam Chairwoman, I yield back.
Thank you so much. Chair now recognizes Mr. Taco for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for organizing this important hearing. Thank you to the witnesses for their crucial testimony. Your experiences at EPA are critical to understanding how we can bring the agency back on track to address the immense environmental and public health challenges facing our nation. As we've heard today, science is vital to EPA's mission. In order for EPA to exercise strong environmental leadership, EPA must act with unquestionable scientific integrity. Sadly, over the past 4 years, there were unprecedented attacks on EPA's scientific infrastructure, and we saw ideology drive environmental policy. I am indeed pleased that President Biden has hit the ground running with several actions to restore scientific integrity across the federal government, including at EPA. I would like to hear recommendations from our witnesses today on how the new leadership at EPA can restore science at the agency. Ms. Fleming, what steps can EPA and its partners take to strengthen science in decision-making and recommit to scientific integrity?
Thank you for the question. I think there are a lot of things that can be done, particularly ensuring that the scientists have access to the newest and latest data sets and information as they are making the important decisions that will undergird the agency's actions going forward. This also means being able to have the staff in-house to be able to analyze that new science and the technology to be able to make it transparent and available. But one of the tools that EPA could use is its Title 42 authority to hire some of the best and brightest minds from academia, from industry, from other parts of the government, and bring them into the EPA fold. This will not only expand EPA's capabilities, but also build the synergies and relationships that'll have that whole government cross-cutting approach that this administration has focused on.
Thank you so much. And Administrator Browner, it's good to see you again. And you state in your testimony that, I quote, well-conducted science is the foundation for EPA and its partners. Again, what steps can EPA take to advance scientific integrity? Because it seems to be the foundation of the work that needs to be done.
So what EPA has to do, I believe, is respect the scientific process. Science asks the questions, it undertakes research, and then it makes a conclusion. And that conclusion is then subjected to peer review. Peer review is a very important part of the scientific process, and it's something that EPA has engaged in and should continue to engage in. But I'll go to the prior witness's answer. You have to make the investment in the scientists. You have to bring into the agency the best people. And I'll just say, when you guys look at the budget of EPA, it looks like maybe a big number to you, But the actual amount of money inside of that budget, a lot of the money goes out to states, it goes to other things. The actual amount of money to hire the quality people is not that high. And so investing in the people, making sure the best scientists want to come to EPA. Historically, they did. If you were an environmental scientist, EPA was the place to be. And we need to rebuild that again.
Thank you so much. And Governor Whitman, welcome. In your testimony, you state that, and I quote, "Good science is the foundation of good policy." So based on where EPA is today, Governor, what can agency leaders do to safeguard scientific integrity and ensure EPA actions are guided by good science?
Well, I think one of the most important things they can do, besides everything that's been mentioned in the previous two responses to your questions, is to protect the scientists, to ensure that the scientists are allowed to go where the science takes them, not where a political desire forces them to go. It is where the science takes them, and they should be allowed to express that and to report that and not fear that they are going to be stifled or moved somewhere because it's not the outcome that the administration wanted politically. And that's a very important part, and added to what you've heard before from the other responders.
Thank you. And Ms. Cleland-Hamnett, you were at EPA for nearly 4 decades as a career civil servant, working under 7 different administrations of both parties. Based on your time at EPA, why is it important that EPA policies be based on credible and transparent science, not ideology or a particular policy outcome?
Please unmute.
Sorry. Very good question. Several reasons come to my mind. One is that in order to best protect the American public health, and the environment, you need to have the best science to understand what the problems are, to figure out how to reduce any threats to public health and the environment, and to carry those things out. It also needs to be good science and credible science for the American public to believe that they are being protected, for the industry to feel that they are being fairly treated, for communities to feel that they can understand what's going on and that they're being represented in decisions. So I think it has to do with both the effectiveness and the credibility of the work that the agency does.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Madam Chair, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Mr. Dunn, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman DeGette. We all value the mission of the Environmental Protection Agency in ensuring we have clean air and water for our generation and future generations. However, burdensome overregulation often does more harm than good in this effort. This is particularly true for the rural communities with large agricultural commodities like the one I represent in Florida's 2nd Congressional District. I'm grateful for some of the work done during the Trump administration on development and implementation of the Navigable Waters Protection Rule, as well as revival of the Farm, Ranch, and Rural Communities Agency. The Navigable Waters Protection Rule is clear, transparent, and informs and guides farmers, ranchers, and foresters without fear of burdensome or oppressive regulation, all while ensuring the preservation of clean water. Now, the rule significantly improves upon previous attempts by clarifying what types of wetlands are jurisdictional and explicitly those which are not, thereby preventing confusion and overreach by the federal government. I believe this policy is a good model for what future administrative action from the EPA should look like. So with that, let me turn to Governor Whitman. It's abundantly clear that the EPA makes decisions that impacts farmers, ranchers, and timber producers. Considering your professional background with the EPA, how can the agency continue to prioritize the valuable insights and input of our agricultural producers in the policymaking process, as well as partner with them to make sensible solutions?
Well, I don't think it's hard to do at all, frankly. I worked very closely with the Secretary of Agriculture while I was there. In fact, we used to meet the Secretary of Agriculture and the Secretary of Interior, as well as Labor. We met on a regular basis to talk about areas and issues that overlapped and where we could work together to try to clarify things, to make things work better for everyone. And that included protecting the public and protecting those who made their living on the land.
So I actually noticed that while you, the EPA administrator, you did collaborate with USDA on controlling waste runoff in agricultural feeding operations. And the USDA actually hailed your effort as unprecedented, and that it would result in stopping billions of pounds of pollutants from entering America's waters. And I would say that you know, that kind of collaboration can lead to creative ways to solve environmental problems. Are there hurdles to the EPA working with other agencies now? Something that they can recreate your efforts?
There shouldn't be any hurdles. I mean, it's a question of the desire to do it and the willingness to listen to one another and talk to one another on a regular basis. I mean, what you're talking about is the nutrient trading program, I believe that we instituted. And that worked well. It protected the public and it made it easier on the farmers and the ranchers to meet the criteria. It saved them money and it saved the water purveyors money. So it was one of those things that worked for everyone. And that has happened under previous administrations. It will happen. It can happen in the future. There is no reason not to be able to do that again.
And do you see it happening now?
I see the potential for it happening now.
Yeah, potential, I agree. I'm not sure it happens as much as it did when you were the administrator.
Well, I can't speak to that. I mean, the administration's pretty new, so I don't know what their track record is yet.
Fair enough. I also noticed that your Whitman Strategy Group offers regulatory and permitting services to help your clients, and this is a quote from your website, understand the ever-changing regulatory and permitting landscape. Well, I know it's ever-changing. I've tried to build things on occasion, and I'm concerned about the processes that are so cumbersome that they become deterrent to new projects. Can you speak to the concerns that businesses have with the permitting processes, the red tape, if you will, and how those threaten new development?
Well, I mean, there certainly is a burden when you have the regulatory process requires you to do certain things that cost time and money. There's no question about it. And I'm a firm believer that we should be reviewing on a regular basis our regulations and the various new ones that are put in place to see whether have we found better technologies? Are we better ways to do it? Do we still need to regulate something? Have we solved that problem or not? And be willing to address those. For instance, we did that with the Hudson River cleanup. We found that what worked in the lab and looked good, I said after 6 months, I wanted to review what the actual impact was on the rivers. We found that in fact, we were releasing more pollutants than we were taking out during the dredging process and the way it was being handled. And so we changed it. And now both sides are working well together. Environmental and the business community that was required to clean up the river are working well together. That's something I think that's there's no problem.
That's a great example of what I was talking about. I thank you, Governor Whitman. We're over time and I yield back.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes Mr. Ruiz for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair DeGette, for having this very important hearing. Communities of color and fence line communities have borne a disproportionate burden from polluters for far too long. The COVID-19 pandemic has only further illuminated these justices. While data is still emerging, a September 2020 study published in the Journal of Environmental Letters found that someone living in a county with high levels of hazardous air pollution was 9% more likely to die from COVID-19 than those who live with less pollution. In my district, air pollution in particular matter put many of my constituents at high risk for underlying conditions like asthma and COPD. To make matters worse, many of these communities are also medically underserved. This combination of poor air quality and lack of access to healthcare puts communities like those in the Coachella Valley at a higher risk of severe COVID-19 disease and death should they become infected. This is why I have dedicated my time to working with farm workers and other fence line communities to promote COVID-19 vaccination and other preventative measures. Even outside of COVID-19, the EPA has an essential mission to reduce pollution and ensure that every community has access to clean air and clean water. Ms. Fleming, in your testimony, you gave several interesting examples of how EPA can, quote, catalyze the revitalization of communities burdened by pollution, unquote. So based on your experience as an EPA regional administrator, what can EPA do going forward to improve both environmental and economic conditions in disadvantaged communities?
Thank you for the question. I think there are a lot of opportunities, and the example with the Regenesis project in Spartanburg, South Carolina speaks to the issue. They had similar concerns, and they were able to capitalize a $20,000 EJ Small grant into $270 million of federal investments, including building out a very robust healthcare center to make sure, series of healthcare centers, to make sure that their constituents' health concerns were taken care of. So that's an example of where EPA, one, can not only provide the seed money, but also work collaboratively within its ranks, whether it's air, water, soil remediation, but then also with the larger federal family. And in Region 4, we started a regional IWG that mirrored the environmental justice IWG at the federal level, and that's something I'd offer.
Thank you very much. Administrator Browner, you have been a strong advocate for environmental justice throughout your career. You led the EPA in 1994 when the agency helped develop and implement the first ever executive order addressing environmental justice. In fact, my legislation, the Environmental Justice Act, builds on your work by codifying and expanding the 1994 executive order on environmental justice. In your testimony today, you state, quote, EPA should take bold actions that protect the health and safety of environmental justice communities that bear the burden of our nation's historical and current reliance on dirty fuels and toxic substances. Administrator Browner, in your opinion, how should today's EPA renew its commitment to environmental justice and take action to achieve meaningful results for vulnerable communities?
Well, first, let me thank you for your leadership on this issue, and let me thank you for introducing legislation to codify. I also think the White House has announced that it will be revisiting that executive order and determining whether or not it can be updated, which I think would be hugely important. I also want to applaud the president for appointing Cecilia Martinez, a known EJ leader, to a role in the White House to coordinate the EJ efforts. But at the end of the day, EPA has regulatory authority. And by setting public health standards that promote the most at risk, we can see real benefits. You talked about the relationship with COVID. So for example, strengthening the fuel efficiency in cars, something that Mr. Trump undid, making sure that the greenhouse gas standards that cars and trucks and buses have to meet are strengthened based again on the science. All of those can bring very real relief.
Thank you. Thank you. I only have 30 seconds left. So I want to ask Governor Whitman, in your testimony, you state, quote, the health and safety of people who live near pollution generating facilities must be better protected. And working with state and local governments, EPA must do a better job in preventing the location of such new facilities in places that lack the political or economic clout to protect their communities and their residents. So how can EPA better work with state and local governments to ensure protections for communities that lack political or economic influence?
Well, they have to be proactive. And when they need to work to ensure that when there is a potential for the location of a facility that is going to produce pollutants, that they ensure that it is not located in a community of color, but simply because there isn't the political clout there to keep it out. And they have to look at the overall impact of what's happening in that area and the air quality in that area, and ensure that when you put a site, that it has the best available technologies as well as where its actual location
Thank you.
is.
Thank you. I think we ran out of time, and the key is the cumulative impact measurement, which is also in my environmental justice bill, is very important. And with that, I yield back to the chair.
Chair now recognizes Mr. Joyce for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon. I would like to thank Chairwoman DeGette, Ranking Member Griffith, Chairman Pallone, Ranking Member McMorris-Rodgers for this hearing, as well as for the witnesses appearing with us today. In 2019, I started hearing concerns about a recent change to stormwater management regulations, which in my district treated smaller municipalities in the same fashion that larger municipalities were treated. This ultimately meant that although many areas of my district lacked the tax base or the revenue streams to upgrade their systems and infrastructure, they would be non-compliant with the new standards. The program in question was implemented by the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection on behalf of the EPA. So I immediately reached out to Regional Administrator Cosmo Servideo and requested a call. Not only was the Regional Administrator responsive to our concerns, but offered to join me for a roundtable discussion with all principals in my district. We had an extremely productive conversation, which included EPA and DEP representatives and local leaders. And we ultimately left with, so importantly, a plan of action that everyone was comfortable with. Today, we've heard a wide range of views on the Trump EPA policies. But when it really mattered to my constituents, they showed up. The regional administrator himself came to my district. He listened and he offered reasonable solutions. That is what leadership at the EPA actually looks like. Chairwoman DeGette, before I ask my questions, I would like to offer an article for the record titled, "One Trump-Era Notion Biden May Want to Embrace. Independent regulators should analyze the costs and benefits of new rules like executive agencies do," for the record.
The gentleman shall submit his article to staff, and then we will admit them all at the end of the hearing.
Thank you, Chair DeGette. During the Trump administration, the Justice Department released a memorandum to the White House that clears a path for improved decision-making by independent regulatory commissions. The opinion concludes that presidents may direct independent agencies to comply with Executive Order 12866, an executive order issued by President Clinton in 1993 and reaffirmed subsequently by both Republican and Democrat presidents since. It requires agencies to perform cost-benefit analysis on all economically significant regulations and to submit them for review by the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs in the Office of Management and Budget before their publication. According to President Obama, and I quote, "The purposes of such review have been to ensure consistency with presidential priorities, to coordinate regulatory policy, and to offer a dispassionate and analytic second opinion on agency actions." My questions then are first to Dr. Deskins. Do you agree that prior to economically significant regulation becoming final, a cost-benefit analysis is necessary, a step to be achieved?
Absolutely, I could not agree more. I mean, cost-benefit analysis is a foundational cornerstone of economics and public policy analysis. It's imperative that we fully understand all the benefits and all the costs of the policy before we move forward. Not to, well, it's hard for me to even speak to that because it's so fundamental. I mean, I've literally taught even undergraduate level public policy analysis, and we devote an entire section of the course to cost-benefit analysis to ensure that we have fully informed decision-making. Absolutely.
Dr. Deskin, is regulatory transparency important for all interested policies and markets to be informed whether the most efficient ways to achieve the objective are being pursued?
Absolutely. I think transparency is of vital importance in government, in policy analysis, all across the spectrum.
Thank you. I see my time is closing out and I yield the balance.
I thank the gentleman. The chair is now pleased to recognize the vice chair of the subcommittee, Mr. Peters, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to thank our witnesses and you for having the hearing. I just want to note that I believe I'm the only former employee of EPA headquarters who serves in Congress. My first job out of college was in the Office of Toxic Substances, where I worked on cost-benefit analysis. I agree with the testimony we just heard. You just have to acknowledge that there's a social cost of carbon that you need to factor in when you do cost-benefit analysis, which was an issue we had with the previous administration. I'm personally interested in helping EPA become effective, responsive, and science-driven, and I think that will certainly help morale, which in turn will help performance. The world is at a critical
juncture in our fight against climate change. The devastating effects of global warming are being seen not just in deadly California wildfires and Texas ice storms, but in countless instances of flood, famine, and extreme weather across the globe. And United States leadership internationally on climate has never been more important. Yet last year, despite opposition from the industry itself, from industry in general, we saw the Trump administration roll back the first ever rule on methane emissions for the oil and gas industry. Methane is 80 times more potent than other greenhouse gases, and man-made methane accounts for at least 25% of today's global warming. I would like to ask Administrator Browner, your testimony states that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's 2018 report and the climate fuel disasters piling on year after year make it clear we have to act now to reduce greenhouse gases or carbon pollution that are causing devastating heat, drought, wildfires, storms, etc. Can you speak to the importance, Administrator, of the United States leadership internationally in climate change, and what actions like the methane rollback signal to other countries about whether we're even serious about this issue?
Thank you. And thank you for mentioning the social cost of carbon, which I believe, I think as you do, is essential to any effective cost benefit analysis or any meaningful cost benefit. The way the global effort works on climate change is each country is to develop their sort of action plan. And under President Obama, we took our action plan to Paris. It was well received. Rolling back those efforts simply takes the United States out of the important global conversations that are going on. This is a tricky situation, right? Because pollution anywhere can affect us all. And so we do have to work with the rest of the world. And I will say I am very, very heartened by the appointment of former Secretary John Kerry, former Senator John Kerry, to lead the U.S. global efforts on climate change. But he will need a strong domestic agenda when he starts to meet with his counterparts so that he can then encourage them to take stronger steps.
Right. I agree with that. And Governor Whitman, I think you've mentioned that reducing carbon emissions, expanding renewable energy, all of these things make sense, whatever your position is on climate change. Fortunately, the Biden administration has instructed EPA to immediately review the methane rollbacks, as well as many other climate-related rollbacks undertaken by the prior administration. In addition to these steps, Governor Whitman and the re-entry into the climate accord in Paris, what actions can EPA take to reestablish itself as an international leader on climate change? You have to unmute, I think.
Sorry, I'm trying to unmute.
Yeah.
I know, it's not unmuting.
No, I can hear you.
Yeah, you're good. Okay, now I'm unmuted. Sorry, it wasn't unmuting right away. I agree with what Administrator Browner said. What we need to do is we have to show action here in the United States in order to be taken seriously internationally. And methane is a bad pollutant. We've recognized that. We know it's something that we can improve human health if we start to take action on it. And this is in a very critical area for the agency and for the United States, for people in general. It's not just for the agency, it's for the health of us, of all of us, of each one of us, and particularly our children. And we need to engage with the international community on an equal basis, but they're not going to take us seriously if they don't see us taking some actions domestically. We just don't have the credibility if we don't show that we're willing to take some steps ourselves.
Right. Yeah, I don't think there's any credible international leadership that can be do as I say, not do as I do. And I think we have to start here. Even as we talk, I think as our colleagues often talk about India and China, entirely appropriately, they are part of the climate solution. We have to set our own example, and we have to be leaders in showing other countries what a developed country can do. So I appreciate your testimony. Completely agree. And Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Chair now recognizes Mr. Palmer for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. And I do want to acknowledge the good work that the EPA has done over the years. We, as I can't remember if it was former Administrator Browner or Whitman that cited the improvements in air quality and the reductions in the pollutants that the EPA tracks. It sounded like they were reading from one of my texts. But I would point out too, though, and this is particularly important in the context of discussions about how we address climate change, the role that China plays and the difficulties that we're going to have addressing this. The EPA estimates that on certain days, nearly 25% of the particulate matter in the skies above Los Angeles can be traced to China. And there are some experts that think that at some point, China could account for a third of all of California's air pollution. So I think we've got to take that into account. I also want to comment on the discussion about reliable science and transparency. I served on the science, space, and task force committee, and there was an issue raised during the Obama administration about the transparency of EPA science and making that science available for peer review. And the EPA has a long practice of not allowing that science to be reviewed. I just wonder what Administrator Browner and Whitman, what your position is on that, given that apparently you both support transparency in the science.
My understanding, sir, of the issue that you're referencing has to do with databases that are held at private institutions that scientists in industry, scientists at universities, scientists at EPA rely on in their work. And there was a proposal to make those databases, not the science, but the database public. And the concern that was raised is those are human health studies and individuals participate in them 20, 30, 40 years. And if their personal health information is made available, you will have a very difficult time getting subjects to participate going forward. So yes, any of the science...
That's not entirely accurate, though. That science is paid for by taxpayer dollars.
In some instances it is, and not all instances is it paid for by taxpayers' dollars. Different institutions.
That the publicly funded...
I do not believe that people's personal health care information should be made available. I believe that when EPA does science, it should absolutely be public and be subject to peer review. I'm not saying anything different than I think anybody else is saying.
Violate HIPAA laws, I agree with that. But
individuals agree to participate in scientific study.
Can I continue with my points? This is publicly funded science. We can take appropriate measures to protect individuals' health data, particularly I think supposed to be protected anyway under the HIPAA laws. But I think that's a real problem with some of the decisions the EPA makes, is that there's questions about the reliability of the science, whether it's real science or more politics. And I think that we need to do a much better job in terms of transparency. You also mentioned an increase in the budget. And one of the things, I introduced legislation several years in a row that would reduce the amount of the EPA budget that's spent on its armed agents. There was a report that came out that talked about resources the EPA used to buy ammunition of 75 millimeter to 125 millimeter ammunition. Those are tank rounds, or anti-tank rounds, which makes no sense. I asked what was the purpose of that, and I was told it was to protect the environment. And my immediate thought was, to protect it from whom? I mean, are you expecting to be invaded by China so that they can come over and pollute? I mean, that makes no sense. And we've had multiple examples over the years of EPA agents showing up in full body armor with automatic weapons at private businesses, even at a municipal waterworks. That makes no sense. So my contention is the EPA wants to have the public trust. We need to have transparency in science. We need to focus more on continuing to improve the quality of our air and water, the toxic release inventory, those type things, and not become a threat that people fear. And Madam Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, gentleman. Chair now recognizes Ms. Schreier for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to our excellent witnesses today. I'm really enjoying this discussion. As mentioned, public health, including children's health and environmental protection, are at the core of EPA's mission. Now, I've been a vocal supporter and advocate for the mercury and air toxic standards. Finalized in 2012, EPA recognized the significant public health benefits of MATS, mercury and air toxic standards. And then the EPA estimated that MATS would yield up to $90 billion in public health benefits each year. In fact, it has been shown to be life-saving, preventing more than 11,000 premature deaths every year and preventing 130,000 asthma attacks each year. Now, pregnant women and children are especially vulnerable to heavy metal exposure because there are profound impacts on central nervous system development. And during the last administration, we saw numerous attempts to attack and undermine MATS. This despite the power industry already having spent billions of dollars to comply and major power sector and labor groups requesting that the standards just be left in place. So I am grateful that President Biden recognizes the importance of MATS, and his executive order from earlier this year will lead to an immediate review of the prior administration's actions regarding MATS, because protecting developing brains should not be a partisan issue. Now, Administrator Browner, as you know in your testimony, the Trump administration did take a number of actions that weakened public health protections, including MATS. Could you just briefly describe what happened to the mercury and air toxic standards during the last administration?
Well, I think you said it. They were weakened and unnecessarily so. One, because they were based on good science, they were based on the law, they had been subject to public review, and industry had embraced them in many instances. So it sort of, there were several of these rollbacks of the Trump administration that were just befuddling because you had industry support for them. You had industry saying, look, these regulations are giving us certainty and predictability, and we're making the investments to meet the standards. Why are you changing them on us? And we do need certainty and predictability in our regulatory frames.
Similar to what we saw in the automobile industry. So just really quickly, before I get into my next question, given where we are today, what steps can the EPA take to protect the vulnerable populations, including children?
From mercury?
From mercury, lead, other pollution.
So they have the authority. They'll need to go through the notice and comment rulemaking, which is a transparent process. They'll have to, dot all their I's, cross all their T's. It will take time, and that is unfortunate that we have lost time. And mercury is a neurotoxin. I mean, this is simple. This is about our children's brains.
That's right. And you're talking to a pediatrician. Okay, I have another question for you. I'm keeping you on the spot today, Administrator Browner. This is a question about a new issue that is really important in Washington State. Last year, scientists finally determined that the chemical 6-PPD, which is added nearly universally to tires as a preservative, was the cause of these mass die-offs of salmon. What we found was that during big storms, runoff in urban areas would just decimate an entire coho population migrating through urban areas. And so my question is, what role do you see the EPA playing in addressing this issue? How would you work with public industry, and what could we do maybe to develop safe alternatives, and how could we help?
So obviously EPA may have some authority on safe alternatives, but more importantly, perhaps in the near term, is EPA under the Clean Water Act gives states money for stormwater. And so designing stormwater systems that can actually suck that pollutant out before that stormwater enters our rivers, lakes, or streams. There are many, many systems now using natural vegetation, for example. And so I think I would want to look at both paths forward, which is how do I clean up the stormwater so it doesn't affect my salmon? And then how do I look at the materials being used and work in cooperation with the industry to see if you can't find a solution?
It's really, I love your thinking. It's really, really hard because these could be teeny streams that just are, they're everywhere. We have water everywhere in Washington State. So thank you for your attention to that. Last quick question. Could you just comment about the rise of pseudoscience? Because I've had conversations with some of my colleagues, and they say that they are founding their conversations in science, and I'm looking at EPA science, and then
EPA was undermined by the last administration. So it's really hard to have a conversation based on facts when there seem to be two set of facts. Could you just comment?
Well, science is a process. It's a really important process. It asks a question, it undertakes an investigation, it brings forward an answer, it peer reviews that answer. And so when we talk about good science, we should be mindful of a process that we're talking about. And what emerges from it then are facts, are scientific findings. What we do with those is a policy discussion. And, you know, we can have a debate about what you want to do about climate change, but the science is very, very clear, right? And so rather than acting like for another, the science isn't clear when you have 2,500 of the world's leading climate scientists all agreeing, and you have 20 years of evidence, let's talk about what we're going to do. And I, for one, think we should do a lot. Others may think less, but let's talk about how we do it in a fair and just manner. Science is a process, and that's what you want to protect is the process.
Thank you. Somebody's time expired. Congresswoman Trahan, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. You know, before I get into some of the issues that are confronting my district in Massachusetts, I wanted to give Ms. Browner specifically just the time and the space to clarify. You know, in his testimony and in responding to questions today, Dr. Deskins has discussed the importance of studying the economic impacts of proposed environmental regulations. You know, Ms. Browner, as someone closely involved in developing environmental regulations at the EPA as administrator, you know, can you please elaborate on how the EPA takes into account both the costs and the benefits of its actions? And I know this is a complicated topic that doesn't lend itself to being cut off, so please take your time so that we can.
Well, thank you. And you know, EPA does a lot of cost benefit analysis. They have done that under Democrats. They have done that under Republican leadership. They look at what will it cost industry to reduce its pollution? What are the benefits to society? When Congress passes a law and tells EPA to go, you know, protect the air that we breathe, sometimes it says, decide what standard to set based on a cost benefit analysis. Sometimes it says decide what standard to set based on public health protection. So Congress makes a decision and directs EPA how to do its work. When I set the first ever fine particle standard, we were using a provision in the law that says protect the public's health. We did a cost benefit analysis. We made that publicly available. We litigated that all the way to the Supreme Court, where they said, you're right, Administrator Browner, it's a public health decision. You know, you did this, but it's a public health decision. So I think it's always important to go back to the science and the law. The second thing I just want to say about cost benefit, we did a 20-year review when I was at EPA, looking at what were the actual costs, what we projected to be the cost, what we projected to be the benefits when the regulation was proposed, and then what actually happened once the regulation was on the books and companies started to meet it. What did we find out? American innovation and ingenuity drove down the cost of compliance. There was a competitive market. There was a market opportunity. We created a better widget, a better scrubber, and the benefits went up. So the history is very, very compelling that the regulatory schemes, yes, look at the costs and the benefits, but those are not going to be absolutely perfect. You have to go back and look at them a second time to really understand. And what we found under the Clean Air Act is the costs were less than originally anticipated and the benefits greater.
Terrific. Thank you so much. I know we all benefit from that, from that knowledge. So one other thing that your testimony speaks not only to the financial assistance that the EPA provides to state, local, and tribal communities, but also the foundational technical support. You know, in Massachusetts, our Department of Environmental Protection has begun regulating PFAS. The Commonwealth had to take this step to protect public health because, frankly, the EPA hasn't really been as aggressive as it needed to be, despite the fact that more and more of our communities, quite a few in my district, are discovering these chemicals in their water. Our towns aren't equipped to handle all of these cleanups on their own, and our state shouldn't be put in a position of doing the EPA's job. The EPA has the resources and the technical expertise and should take a greater leadership role. Administrator Browner, other than financial assistance, what are the ways the EPA supports state and local governments, and what does the EPA need to continue those vital efforts so that our decision-making isn't being delayed?
So two things I think are important here. I come out of state government. I ran a large state agency before I got to EPA. So I understand sort of who can do what. EPA has the scientist, it has the capabilities to sort of do the large scale studies that then can tell you what are the actions that need to be taken. And so that's hugely important, and the states need to look to EPA for that. Having said that, however, if a state feels like it should set a tougher standard when it comes to their water bodies, the case you give, they should be allowed to do that. I do not believe that EPA standards should preempt individual states. So for example, in Florida, where I come from, the Florida Everglades is a very different ecosystem than the Chesapeake Bay, than perhaps the bays in Massachusetts. And so we want to preserve the ability for states to build on what EPA is doing, particularly when it comes to protecting our watersheds.
Sure. I think the issue that we have is that there's varying levels of what constitutes contamination. And so that just breeds a lack of confidence when you're going from state to state. So I appreciate all of that. Thank you so much. I yield back.
Thank you. I thank the gentlelady. All of the members of the subcommittee have now questioned, and it's the practice of the committee to allow members who are not on the subcommittee, but the full Committee of Energy and Commerce to question. And we're delighted to have several of our members joining us. First of all, Congresswoman Castor. And so I'd like to recognize you and welcome you for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. I really appreciate you letting me weigh on today, because I really care about the EPA, and the witnesses have just been terrific. Thank you, each one of you, for underscoring how a strong and effective EPA is critical to avoiding the growing cost and impacts of the climate crisis, and to meeting our moral obligation that we have to our kids and future generations. And Administrator Brown, it's great to see you. Thank you for your longtime service and to the state of Florida. You highlight an urgent priority for the Biden-Harris administration in tackling climate. It's escalating cost, something we don't talk about often enough, the growing impacts on the air that we breathe, and doing it with an eye towards environmental justice. Those communities that often bear the burdens associated with exposure to multiple cumulative sources of pollution, as Dr. Ruiz brought up before. In our Climate Crisis Action Plan that House Democrats developed last year, we had a number of recommendations when it comes to EPA and environmental justice: to consider cumulative impacts, to enforce, to use the enforcement power and double the budget there, identify 100 communities of the most overburdened by industrial pollution, target for an enforcement surge, and prioritize environmental justice communities for new federal investments, and then build the capacity of those groups across the country so they truly can weigh in when it comes to those investments and the cumulative impacts. What would you highlight to us on these kind of science-based strategies? Where should the EPA pick up on our recommendations, and where should Congress be placing its emphasis going forward?
Thank you, and thank you for your leadership on climate change. It is been wonderful to watch. Two things. You mentioned cumulative impact. This is very, very important, and it is tricky under the current law. And we heard from one of the other witnesses discussions about perhaps civil rights laws, but you have every facility in an area might be meeting its permit conditions, but the people who live there are being exposed to 6 facilities. So that cumulative impact. And so I think we need to look at what are the tools EPA will need to address cumulative impact. Are there tools on the books? But I think cumulative impact for these fence line communities, for these environmental justice communities, I think are hugely important. The second thing I would say is they need a seat at the table. And this is really important. They need to be at the table. Look, I work in the environmental community. I chair an environmental board. We've got lots of national groups out there who are doing really important work. But, you know, we also need to hear from the people in Tampa, from the people in St. Pete, from the people who are on those frontline communities. I did a deal when I was at EPA with Intel, and we brought in the fence line community. And that deal radically changed once we listened to the community. And it turned out to be good for the community, good for Intel. So there is a way to do this, but we need to give them a seat at the table.
And Ms. Fleming, you also have a great deal of experience, and thank you for your service, especially in the Southeast region. What do you recommend here? You gave Dr. Ruiz a good example before, but how do we ensure that folks do truly have a seat at the table? And what do you think about the idea of really reaching out to the overburdened communities and starting there?
I think that's our number one priority. And again, I'd recommend that we listen first. Obviously, EPA has a tremendous amount of science and technology it can rely upon. The temptation is to come up with ideas and suggestions, but that may be premature until you actually hear from the community and understand what their real concerns are, what they're looking for. And then with that knowledge, use the technology to help identify solutions that will meet their needs.
So, and Administrator Governor Whitman, what can you point to? Think about how we empower these communities, ramp up EPA enforcement at the same time to make sure that we're truly getting at the impacts, kind of these multiplier impacts of climate change.
I'm sorry, was that directed at me? I'm having a terrible time with transmission.
That's the next
cutting
hearing
in
we're
and
going
out.
to have is on.
Yeah, we're going to, part of the Select Committee's recommendations is better broadband across the country too, so we can empower communities and farmers to do these kind of things. So thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'll yield back.
Wait, go ahead, Administrator Whitman. You can answer. Do you want to re-ask your question, Ms. Castor?
Yeah, again, it was your perspective on reaching out to environmental justice communities, helping to ramp up EPA enforcement, but making sure we're making the investments in communities that are on the front lines. What would you have the Congress prioritize?
I think it's absolutely essential to work in as close conjunction with the affected communities as you possibly can, and particularly with the environmental justice communities, because they have been unfortunately the subject of too much pollution, ignorance really. People have ignored them, ignored their place at the table. And so EPA really has a responsibility to take that upon themselves, to reach out and to ensure, to work with the communities and see what it is they want, what they say their biggest issues are. It may be different than what EPA thinks it is. We had a facility down in Camden where you couldn't walk down the streets of that community without smelling the stink from the sewage plant. I mean, that was what their reality was, and that's what needed to be dealt with. It might have been different. Others may have said, well, it's overall air pollution. It was the smell. You'd start there, and make their quality of life better, but you have to be talking to the people involved to do that at all levels. It's not just with those communities, it's with all of them.
Thank you. I thank the gentlelady. And waiting patiently has been one of the newest members of our full committee, and we're delighted to have her joining us today. Ms. Fletcher, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chairwoman DeGette, for holding this important hearing and for allowing me to weigh on and participate today. In my hometown of Houston and in the state of Texas, we are all too familiar with the challenges of extreme weather events brought on by climate change. And at this very moment, Texans are recovering from yet another extreme weather event. This time, a winter storm brought by disruptions to the polar vortex that resulted in some of the coldest temperatures on record. That storm and the resulting loss of power and water devastated our state. Texans froze to death in their own beds just a few weeks ago. The scientists tell us that these extreme weather events will increase. and we must do everything possible to understand, prepare for, and respond to these extreme weather events. And it's with that in mind that I want to follow up on something that you said earlier, Ms. Fleming, in response to a question from Ms. Rice, that we need to have sufficient staff around the country for enforcement in that context, presumably for other purposes. And as of now, EPA's Region 6 Houston Laboratory, which is an important and full-service analytical lab that serves Arizona, Louisiana, New Mexico, Oklahoma, and Texas, is slated to be relocated to Ada, Oklahoma. We've heard from employees at this lab, at the lab, that they are extremely concerned about the relocation. Many of them simply can't uproot their families and make the move. I'm concerned, and I think this touches on Ms. Schakowsky's questions, that this could further shrink the size of the EPA's workforce, undermine recruitment efforts, and undermine its mission. I'm also concerned that we need a robust EPA lab presence that can address the most urgent environmental concerns, especially during these extreme weather events in places like Houston, which has a high concentration of chemical plants and refineries. Madam Chair, I would like to ask that 2 letters I sent during the last Congress questioning the relocation of this facility be entered into the record. One is dated July 12, 2019 to former Acting Administrator Andrew Wheeler, and one is dated December 19th, 2019 to Acting Inspector General Charles Sheehan.
And all of the documents will be submitted at the end of the hearing.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So Ms. Fleming, based on your experience leading EPA Region 4 and as EPA's Chief of Staff, can you explain how the agency's lab network and its dedicated public servants are central to the mission of EPA, and how the relocation and labs could lead to a shrinking of this dedicated workforce and any other issues you see here?
Sure, certainly. Thank you for the question. And I think it raised something that we haven't yet discussed today, and that's EPA's ability to respond in disasters, whether it's hurricanes, whether it's the wildfires. And I have on good authority that with the situation in Texas, there were 3 mobile labs that deployed to Texas, 2 from Atlanta and 1 from Kentucky. So that gives you the sense of the regional footprint and how it's an all hands on deck response. But in order to respond, you need those hands. And so EPA's lab system is headed obviously by the Office of Research and Development in headquarters, but there are 10 different labs around the country. Each region has a science advisor or science liaison. The administrator has a science liaison. But the key, to your point, Congresswoman, is to make sure that all of that science, all of that technology, those analysts are available in the communities that need them, whether it's disaster response, whether it's air pollution, whether it's environmental justice concerns. The network needs to be bolstered so that the people who need the help most have the fastest access to it.
Thank you so much. So I take it you would agree with me that it's important to support and retain EPA staff and build its scientific capacity rather than dismantle it with these kinds of actions.
Absolutely. I was a public servant for 24 years before going into the private sector. It is an honorable profession, and I think we need to encourage more people to join us.
Well, thank you so much for that. And thanks to all of you for your insights today. I have another question, but with limited time, I will just submit for the record if anyone else wants to weigh in on this question of why it's so essential that we have a strong, effective, well-resourced, and well-located EPA to mitigate and adapt for these impacts of climate change, these extreme weather events, and other things that we're seeing across the country. So thank you so much for your time today, and thank you, Madam Chair, for including me in this important hearing.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman. And I want to add my thanks to every single one of our witnesses for their participation in today's hearing. We dodged the bullet. They didn't call votes on the floor, so I thought it was a very robust and excellent conversation. I'd like to remind members that pursuant to the committee rules, they have 10 business days to submit additional questions for the record to be answered by the witnesses. And I would ask the witnesses to agree to respond promptly to such questions if you receive any. We have had some documents that have been requested by unanimous consent, and they will be inserted. Let me list them. A letter from 6 former EPA administrators dated August 12, 2020 from me. A letter from Representative Fletcher to EPA's Acting Inspector General dated December 19, 2019. A letter from Representative Green and others to EPA's Acting Administrator dated July 12, 2019, both of those submitted by Ms. Fletcher. An op-ed from the Wall Street Journal dated January 3, 2021 by Mr. Joyce. A fact sheet from the EPA on key accomplishments under Administrator Wheeler from Mr. McKinley. A report from the EPA reviewing the agency's decisions or actions in 2020 from Mr. McKinley, and an article from the Washington Post on fentanyl dated March 13, 2019 by Mr. Burgess, that without objection so ordered. With that, thanks again to everybody, and the subcommittee is adjourned.